Ibrahim woke not to a bell or to a voice, but to the pressure of the day on his eyelids, a familiar weight that came every morning at this precise moment and had done so for more than 40 years. He was a man of 63 winters, and his body knew the time better than any clock imported from the foundries of Europe. His back ached, in the particular way that meant he had slept on his right side with his left arm folded under the thin wool blanket. His knees clicked when he swung his legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, a sound so quiet that only he could hear it, and only because he had been listening for it each morning since the joints first began to speak to him in this manner, some 12 years past. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry in the apothecary trade, and certainly no reason to hurry in the year 1725 during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, when the city of Constantinople had settled into a long and gentle exhale of peace that would later be remembered as the Tulip Era. His feet found the cool stone of the floor, and then the rough wool of his slippers placed precisely where he had left them the night before. The slippers were old and the stitching around the heel had begun to loosen, but the felted wool still held the shape of his foot, and this small familiarity was one of the 1,000 tiny anchors that kept a man of his years steady in the stream of days. He stood and the sleeping platform creaked once as the weight left it, then fell silent. The room behind the shop was small and contained only the platform, a cedar chest for his clothing, and a copper basin that held water drawn from the courtyard well the evening prior. He splashed the water onto his face, and the shock of its coolness was the only sharp sensation he would permit himself before the work began. After drying his face with a square of rough linen, he dressed in the same manner he had dressed every morning since he was a young apprentice under the old Armenian apothecary named Takapum, who had owned this shop before him. Trousers of undyed wool, a long shirt of cotton that had once been white but was now the color of old parchment, and over this a sleeveless vest with deep pockets that held a collection of small useful things, a stub of beeswax, a length of twine, a smooth river pebble that served no purpose other than to be touched when his hands were idle. The front room of the shop was separated from his sleeping quarters by a heavy curtain of dark blue wool that had faded along the fold lines to a soft grey. He pushed it aside and stepped into the space where he would spend the next 12 hours of his life as he had spent the 12 hours of the day before and would spend the 12 hours of the day after. The shop smelled of the things that lived in jars and ceramic vessels and wooden boxes. There was the sharp mineral scent of dried alum, the dusty sweetness of licorice root, the faint floral ghost of rose petals that had been distilled 3 summers ago and still clung to the inside of the copper alembic that sat unused on the highest shelf. And under all of these there was the smell of old wood and clay, and the particular mustiness of a room that was opened only once each day and closed only once each night. He walked to the door, not quickly, but with the steady, measured pace of a man who had learned long ago that rushing only created more work, because rushed hands dropped things, and rushed feet stumbled, and a dropped jar of saffron was a calamity that no amount of saved time could ever repay. The door was heavy, made of cypress planks joined with iron straps, and it swung inward on hinges that he kept greased with a smear of rendered mutton fat twice each year, in the spring after the rains stopped, and in the autumn before the first frost. He lifted the iron bolt and the metal slid against its bracket with a low grinding sound that was not unpleasant but rather reassuring, a sound that meant the shop was opening and the day was beginning and the world outside was once again permitted to see what he had to offer. The door swung inward and the light came in all at once, flooding across the floor and climbing the legs of the heavy workbench and reaching toward the shelves on the northern wall where the jars waited in the shadows. The morning light in Constantinople during the early years of the 18th century was different from the light of other cities, or even the light of other centuries. It came filtered through the constant presence of the sea and through the smoke of 10,000 breakfast fires burning dried animal dung, and olive pits and bits of driftwood gathered along the shores of the Bosphorus. By the time it reached the narrow streets of the old city, it had been softened and warmed, and it fell upon the cobblestones and the wooden balconies and the faces of the shopkeepers with a kind of golden patience. Inside the apothecary shop it pooled on the floor in a rectangular shape that exactly matched the dimensions of the open doorway. Dust motes that had been invisible in the darkness suddenly became visible, suspended in the golden shaft like tiny fragments of memory, or perhaps like the spirits of the ground herbs that had escaped their jars during the long night. Ibrahim stood in the doorway for a moment, not to admire the day, for he was not a man given to admiration of things that happened every morning without fail, but simply to let his eyes adjust and to feel the temperature of the air on his face. It was early autumn, and the mornings had begun to carry a hint of the cold that would arrive in earnest by the month of Muharram, but for now the air was pleasant and still. From somewhere down the street near the small mosque with the single minaret came the sound of a broom. It was not the sharp hiss of a modern broom on smooth stone, but the softer, more irregular scrape of bundled twigs against uneven cobblestones. The street sweeper was an old man named Mustafa, who had been sweeping this same stretch of Akshamseddin Street since before Ibrahim had purchased the shop from old Hagab. Mustafa did not speak to anyone during his sweeping, and no one spoke to him, and this arrangement suited everyone on the street perfectly. The sound of his broom was a second marker of the day's beginning, following the call to prayer and preceding the opening of the spice merchant's shutters 2 doors down. Ibrahim turned back into the shop and began the first of the morning's small rituals. On the floor, just inside the doorway, there was always a fine layer of dust and small debris that had blown in under the door during the night, or that had simply settled out of the still air when the shop was closed and dark. He retrieved the hand broom from its hook beside the doorframe, a simple tool made from a bundle of straw bound tightly with hemp cord, and he began to sweep. The motion was slow and deliberate, and it followed a pattern that his arm knew without any direction from his conscious mind. He started at the threshold and swept outward in a gentle arc, sending the dust and the tiny fragments of dried leaf and the single dead moth that had somehow found its way inside back out onto the street, where Mustafa's larger broom would eventually catch them and move them along to the drainage channel at the corner. The sweeping took perhaps 3 minutes, and when it was finished, he hung the broom back on its hook, and the floor was as clean as it would be all day. The next task was the arrangement of the jars. This was not a task of cleaning, but of positioning, a small adjustment that Ibrahim performed every morning without exception and without any conscious memory of having performed it the day before. Along the front of the shop, just inside the threshold, he kept 3 large ceramic jars that held the least expensive and most commonly requested items in his inventory. The first jar held dried mint leaves harvested from the hills above Uskudar and dried slowly in the shade of a fig tree. The second jar held whole chamomile flowers, pale yellow and fragile, and smelling of the earth after a light rain. The third jar held the small hard seeds of the fennel plant, which the local women bought to chew after meals or to boil into a weak tea for colicky infants. These jars were glazed a deep blue that was the color of the Bosphorus on a winter afternoon, and they stood on a low wooden shelf just high enough that a customer standing in the street could see the contents without having to stoop or enter the shop. Each morning, Ibrahim would check the position of these jars. He would turn them so that the side with the least glaze wear faced outward toward the street. He would adjust the angle so that the morning light caught the curve of the ceramic in a way that he had learned long ago was pleasing to the eye and therefore conducive to the slow browsing that sometimes led to a purchase. He would lift each lid, a flat disc of the same blue ceramic with a small knob on top, and he would peer inside to confirm that no insects had found their way into the dried herbs during the night. This had happened only twice in 40 years. Once a small beetle had nested in the chamomile, and once a spider had spun a single thread across the mouth of the mint jar. But the checking was not about the actual risk. The checking was about the ritual. The ritual was about the order. The order was about the calm. After the blue jars were arranged, he turned to the interior of the shop where the more valuable items were kept. These were stored in smaller containers on shelves that lined the northern wall, the wall that never received direct sunlight, and therefore remained the coolest part of the shop even during the height of summer. The shelves were made of cypress wood that had darkened over the decades to a deep honey brown, and they were divided into cubbies of varying sizes to accommodate vessels of varying shapes. There were glass bottles with narrow necks, stoppered with cork and sealed with red wax. There were small ceramic pots with fitted lids that made a soft popping sound when opened. There were wooden boxes carved from walnut with sliding tops that moved smoothly along grooves worn by years of use. And there was a single jar of Chinese porcelain white with blue painted designs of twisting vines that had come to Constantinople by way of the Silk Road and the Red Sea and the camel caravans that crossed the desert from Damascus, and it held the most precious substance in the entire shop. The saffron threads that would later in the day be combined with the opium resin to make the compound for which Ibrahim's shop was known among the physicians and the wealthy households of the city. He did not touch the saffron jar now. The morning was for the ordinary things, the things that required no special care and no particular concentration. Instead, he walked slowly along the shelves, and his eyes passed over each container in turn, checking for any sign of disturbance. A jar that had been nudged out of alignment, a lid that sat slightly askew, a small pile of dust that had accumulated in the corner of a cubby. He found none of these things because he had left the shop in perfect order the night before, and because nothing moved in the shop during the night except the slow descent of the dust motes that he had already swept back out onto the street. But he looked, anyway. The looking was part of the rhythm. From outside, the sound of Mustafa's broom had moved farther down the street, and now it was joined by other sounds. The creak of wooden shutters being opened at the spice merchant's shop, the distant cry of a vendor selling fresh simit from a tray balanced on his head, the clop of a donkey's hooves on the cobblestones as it pulled a small cart loaded with clay pots toward the Grand Bazaar. These sounds came to Ibrahim not as distractions, but as confirmations that the world was proceeding as it always had, and as it always would. He was a small part of this world, a single cell in the body of the city, and his function was to remain in this place, and to grind his compounds, and to wait for the customers who would come or who would not come. He walked to the workbench that dominated the center of the front room, a massive slab of oak that had been cut from a single tree somewhere in the forests of Bithynia and hauled to Constantinople on a cart pulled by 6 oxen more than a century before Ibrahim was born. The surface of the bench was scarred with the marks of countless pestles and the stains of countless tinctures, and the shallow grooves worn by the sliding of countless ceramic bowls from one end of the bench to the other. It was a surface that told a story without words, a story of repetition and patience and the slow transformation of raw materials into remedies. He placed both palms flat on the wood and felt the cool, smooth grain beneath his fingers. The bench was ready. He was ready. The day had begun. The morning light had shifted slightly now, creeping deeper into the shop and climbing higher on the walls. It illuminated the dust that still hung in the air, despite his sweeping a fine particulate of dried leaves and pollen, and the microscopic debris of a city that had been inhabited continuously for more than 2,000 years. The light touched the edge of the large ceramic mortar that sat at the far end of the workbench, the mortar that he would use later in the day for the grinding of the saffron and the opium. The ceramic was a warm terracotta color glazed on the inside, but left rough and porous on the outside to provide a better grit for the hands that would hold it steady. It was empty now and clean, and it waited with the patience of an object that had no concept of time or of the work that would soon be required of it. Ibrahim sat down on the low wooden stool that he had carved himself during a slow winter some 15 years earlier. The stool had 3 legs, because 3 legs never wobbled on an uneven stone floor, and it was exactly the right height to bring his elbows level with the surface of the workbench. He sat and he did nothing. This was the final part of the morning ritual, the moment of stillness that came after the sweeping and the arranging and the checking and before the first actual task of the day. He looked at the light and the floor, and he listened to the sounds of the street, and he felt the weight of his own body settling onto the stool. His breathing was slow and even, and his thoughts, if he had any thoughts at all, were of no more consequence than the dust motes drifting through the shaft of sunlight. A bird landed briefly on the windowsill where the oiled parchment was stretched across a wooden frame to let in light while keeping out insects and curious glances. The bird was a small brown sparrow, and it cocked its head once twice and then flew away, leaving behind nothing but the faint memory of a shadow that had passed across the parchment and the sound of tiny claws scratching against the wood. The morning of this particular day in the autumn of 1725 was no different from the morning that had come before it, or the morning that would follow. The city of Constantinople lay under a sky that was clear and pale blue, fading to white near the horizon, where the waters of the Golden Horn met the air. The tulips that had given their name to this era of peace and pleasure were long finished, blooming, and their bulbs lay dormant in the earth of the palace gardens and the courtyards of the wealthy, waiting for the cold of winter to trigger the slow chemistry that would bring them back to life in the spring. In the narrow street called Akshimzetten, the apothecary named Ibrahim sat on his three-legged stool and waited for the day to bring him whatever it would bring. And he was content with this waiting because he had learned over the course of 63 winters that most of life was waiting, and that the waiting itself could be a kind of work if you approached it with the proper stillness of mind. The sun climbed higher, and the rectangle of light on the floor shortened and widened, and the shop filled with the quiet hum of a world that required nothing from him except his presence and his patience in his hands, that knew the weight of a pestle and the texture of dried saffron and the slow turning of the hours, until the evening call would signal the heavy cypress door and let the darkness return. The northern wall of the apothecary shop was the wall that never saw the sun. This was by design and not by accident, for old Haggap had explained to Ibrahim during his first week as an apprentice that heat was the enemy of dried herbs and that light was the accomplice of decay. The northern exposure remained cool throughout the year, even during the heavy days of August, when the cobblestones of Ashton Stitton Street grew warm enough to soften the tar that sealed the scenes of the fishing boats down at the harbour. The wall itself was thick stone covered with a layer of plaster that had been mixed with crushed marble dust to give it a slight reflective quality, a pale gleam that helped whatever small amount of light entered the shop to bounce deeper into the recesses of the shelves. Against this pale surface, the cypress wood shelving stood in warm contrast, a structure that had been built into the wall itself with pegs and joints, and not a single iron nail, because iron could rust and rust could flake, and flakes of rust could fall into an open jar of powdered cinnamon and ruin a batch worth more than a month of ordinary sales. The shelving system was divided into 47 cubbies of varying dimensions, and each cubby had been measured and cut to accommodate a specific vessel or a specific category of vessel. The largest cubbies occupied the bottom row closest to the floor, where the air was coolest and most stable, and these held the ceramic jars that contained the heavy dense materials that were sold by weight rather than by pinch or dram. There was a jar of dried alum crystals, milky white and sharp-edged, and smelling faintly of metal, that the dyes of cloth purchased for fixing their colours, and that the women of the neighbourhood sometimes requested for tightening the skin around the eyes. Beside it stood a jar of natron, the natural salt from the dried lake beds of Egypt that had been used since the time of the pharaohs for preserving things that would otherwise decay. The jar was heavy, and Ibrahim had not opened it in nearly 3 years because the natron did not spoil and the demand for it was slow and sporadic. Moving upward, the middle shelves held the mid-sized containers that contained the bulk of the shop's daily commerce. There were glass bottles with narrow necks and wide bases blown in the furnaces of Murano and carried across the sea by Venetian merchants who sold them to Greek traders, who brought them through the Dardanelles and into the harbour of Constantinople, where they were purchased by apothecaries like Ibrahim for prices that reflected the risk of breakage during the long journey. The glass was not perfectly clear by modern standards, containing small bubbles and faint swirls of green where the iron in the sand had not been fully refined away, but these imperfections were considered beautiful, and the customers who noticed such things often commented on the way the light played through the thicker portions of the glass. Each bottle was stoppered with a cork that had been cut from the bark of cork oaks that grew in the western reaches of the empire, and each cork was sealed with a disc of red wax impressed with Ibrahim's small brass seal, a simple design of a mortar and pestle surrounded by a circle of dots. The bottles contained liquids, and the liquids required special care. There was rose water, distilled from the petals of the damask rose that grew in the valley of Isparta, and was brought to Constantinople in copper flasks by a merchant who made the journey only once each year in the month after the harvest. The rose water was clear as rainwater, and its scent was so potent that even through the glass of the cork and the wax it managed to perfume the air of that particular cubby, and a customer standing near the northern wall with their eyes closed might have believed themselves transported to a garden in full bloom. Beside the rose water stood a bottle of lavender oil pressed from the flowering tops of plants that grew on the slopes of a mountain whose name Ibrahim had never learned, because the merchant who supplied it spoke a dialect of Greek that Ibrahim could only partially understand. The oil was pale yellow and viscous, and a single drop placed on the wrist would release a fragrance that lingered for hours. There were other liquids in other bottles on other shelves, a dark amber tincture of myrrh that had been steeping in grain alcohol for 14 months and would continue to steep until someone purchased it, or until Ibrahim decided it had reached its peak potency. whichever came first, a bottle of camphor dissolved in oil of rosemary, a preparation that the older men of the neighborhood rubbed into their aching knees during the damp months of winter, a small square bottle of quicksilver that Ibrahim kept only because old Haggab had kept it, and because there were still physicians in the city who believed in its properties despite the growing evidence that it did more harm than good. But Ibrahim was an apothecary, not a physician, and his role was to supply what was requested, not to judge the wisdom of the request. Above the liquids on a shelf that required Ibrahim to stand on his toes and stretch his arm to its full length were the jars and boxes that contained the dried botanicals, the leaves and flowers and stems and roots and seeds that formed the foundation of the apothecary's art. These were arranged in an order that made sense only to Ibrahim and to the ghost of old Haggab who had taught him the arrangement. Alfalfa leaf sat next to angelica root, which sat next to anise seed, which sat next to anise flowers. The alphabetical progression was not strict, but it was close enough that Ibrahim could find any item in the dark if necessary, though he had never been called upon to do so. Each container bore a label written in Ottoman Turkish script, using a reed pen and a simple iron gall ink that had faded over the years from black to a soft brown. The labels were not decorative, they were functional, and they listed the name of the substance and the date of its acquisition, and in some cases the name of the merchant from whom it had been purchased. The dried chamomile flowers occupied a ceramic jar of medium size glazed on the inside with a clear coating that prevented the oils from the flowers from leaching into the porous clay. The flowers themselves were pale yellow and fragile, and they had been harvested in the early morning when the dew was still on the petals, because old Haggab had taught that chamomile picked after the sun had risen lost some essential quality that could not be named but could be felt. The jar was nearly full because Ibrahim had received a fresh shipment only 2 weeks earlier from a farmer who cultivated a small plot of land on the Asian shore just north of Kadikoha. Beside the chamomile sat a jar of dried lavender buds, smaller and darker than the fresh flowers and used primarily for filling small cloth sachets that women tucked into their clothing drawers to keep the moths away. There was a wooden box with a sliding lid made of walnut, and inside the box, nested in a bed of raw cotton wool, were 12 dried poppy heads, each one the size of a child's fist, and each one bearing the small circular scar where the latex had been scored and collected months earlier in the fields of Afinakarahizar. The poppy heads themselves contained only trace amounts of the latex now properly dried and cured, and waiting in the form of dark bricks in a separate container. But Ibrahim kept them because some of the older women in the neighborhood believed that a tea made from the dried pods could ease the aches of age, and Ibrahim had learned long ago not to argue with the beliefs of the older women in the neighborhood. On a shelf set slightly apart from the others, protected by a small door made of cedar wood that swung on brass hinges, stood the jars that contained the more costly items, the substances that Ibrahim measured with the smaller set of scales and handled with the smaller horn spatula and kept a more careful accounting of in the leather-bound ledger that lived in the drawer beneath the workbench. Here was the jar of saffron threads, the same jar of Chinese porcelain with the blue painted vines that he had noted during his morning inspection. The jar was only half full because Ibrahim had sold a dram of saffron to the cook of a wealthy household in the Fenner district 2 weeks earlier for a dish that would be served at a wedding feast. Saffron was the dried stigma of a particular crocus flower, and each flower produced only 3 stigmas, and each stigma was a thread so fine that it took 70,000 flowers to produce a single pound of the spice. The threads in Ibrahim's jar were deep red with slightly lighter orange tips, and they smelled of hay and honey and something metallic that no one had ever been able to describe adequately. Next to the saffron sat a small ceramic pot with a fitted lid that made a soft popping sound when opened, and inside were the dried buds of the clove tree, each one a small brown nail of concentrated aroma. Cloves came from islands so distant that Ibrahim had only seen them on maps painted in colors that bore no relation to the actual geography of the sea, and they arrived in Constantinople after passing through the hands of Arab traders and Indian merchants and the captains of Portuguese ships who guarded the source of their supply with a jealousy that had shaped the commerce of entire oceans. Beside the cloves was a jar of cinnamon bark curled into tight scrolls that resembled the ancient manuscripts stored in the library of the Topkapı Palace. though Ibrahim had never seen those manuscripts and was only repeating a comparison he had once heard from a scholar who had visited the shop to purchase a remedy for his failing eyesight. There were other precious things on the cedar-shelved section, a small quantity of ambergris, a waxy substance that floated on the surface of distant seas and was gathered from beaches where it had washed ashore after being expelled by whales in a process that no one fully understood, but that produced a material of such complex fragrance that it was worth more than its weight in silver. A vial of genuine balsam of Mecca, so thick that it had to be warmed before it would flow from the bottle. A cache of nutmegs, each one enclosed in a hard shell that was itself enclosed in a lacy red covering called mace, and both the nutmeg and the mace were useful for different purposes, and both commanded prices that made Ibrahim count the pieces twice each month to ensure that none had gone missing. The ox-horn spatulas hung from a row of small brass hooks mounted on the side of the shelving unit. There were 7 spatulas in total, each one carved from the horn of an ox that had lived and worked and died somewhere in the Anatolian interior. The horn was a material that Ibrahim preferred over wood or metal because it was smooth and non-porous and did not react with the substances it touched and did not absorb flavors or odors that might contaminate the next compound it was used to measure. The largest spatula was as long as Ibrahim's forearm and as wide as 2 fingers, and it was used for scooping the bulk materials from the big ceramic jars on the bottom shelf. The smallest spatula was no longer than his little finger and no wider than a grain of wheat, and it was used exclusively for the saffron and the ambergris and the other substances that required a touch so delicate that even the weight of a larger tool might crush or bruise the material. The spatulas had been carved by a craftsman in the town of Kütahya who specialized in hornwork, and who had died some 20 years ago, leaving behind a son who did not share his father's patience for the slow shaping and polishing of ox horn. Ibrahim had purchased a lifetime supply of spatulas from the old craftsman during his final year of work, and he kept the extras wrapped in oiled cloth in the cedar chest in his sleeping quarters. The ones on the hoops were the ones he used daily, and they had acquired a patina from the oils of his fingers and from the countless substances they had lifted and transferred and scraped. The patina was a soft golden brown, darker at the tips where the most contact occurred, and it gave the spatulas the appearance of objects that had been handled with care for a very long time. The copper scales sat on a dedicated platform at the eastern end of the workbench, where they would not be jostled by the grinding and mixing that occurred elsewhere on the bench. The scales were of the equal arm balance type, a design that had been used by merchants and apothecaries and alchemists for thousands of years, and that required no springs or gears or complex mechanisms to function. A central brass pillar supported a horizontal beam that pivoted on a hardened steel knife edge. From each end of the beam hung a copper pan, suspended by 3 silk threads that had been twisted together for strength, and then untwisted slightly so that they hung straight without any residual torsion that might affect the balance. The pans themselves were polished to a soft gleam on the inside, but the outsides had been left to develop a natural patina of deep brown that deepened toward the edges where the copper was thinnest. Beside the scales sat a wooden block drilled with a series of cylindrical holes of varying depths, and in each hole rested a brass weight. The weights were shaped like small cups that nested inside one another when not in use, and each was stamped with a mark that indicated its value in dirhams and fractions of dirhams. The largest weight was 10 dirhams, and the smallest was 1/4 of a dirham, and between them were all the gradations necessary to measure any quantity that a customer might request, from a single pinch of saffron to a full pound of dried mint leaves. The weights were old, and the stamp marks had been worn smooth in places, but Ibrahim knew them by their shapes and by their positions in the wooden block, and he had not misidentified a weight in more than 30 years. The humidity from the Bosphorus was a constant presence in the shop, and it affected the copper scales in subtle ways that Ibrahim had learned to anticipate and correct. On damp mornings when the sea mist rolled up from the Golden Horn and settled in the narrow streets, the brass beam would expand by an amount too small to see, but large enough to affect the balance. On these mornings, Ibrahim would recalibrate the scales by adding a single grain of rice to one pan or the other until the beam hung perfectly level. The grain of rice was kept in a small ceramic dish on the scale platform, and it was the same grain of rice that had been used for this purpose for the past several months, because Ibrahim saw no reason to replace it until it crumbled or was lost. The recalibration was a small act of maintenance that took no more than a minute, and it was performed without conscious thought, as automatic as breathing. The glass alembics occupied the highest shelf of all, a place that Ibrahim could only reach by standing on the three-legged stool, and even then only by stretching his arm to its full extension. There were 2 alembics, both of them made in Murano, and both of them purchased by old Hagop during a period of prosperity that had preceded Ibrahim's apprenticeship. An alembic was a vessel for distillation consisting of a round-bottomed pot called the cucurbit, and the domed lid called the head, and a long downward-sloping tube called the beak, through which the condensed vapor would flow into a receiving flask. The glass was thin and delicate, and the 2 alembics had been stored on the highest shelf for as long as Ibrahim could remember, because he had no need to distill anything in the ordinary course of his business, and the risk of breaking such valuable and irreplaceable objects far outweighed any benefit that might come from using them. The smaller of the 2 alembics had a capacity of perhaps 1 liter, and it had been used primarily for the distillation of rose water in the days when old Hagop still had the energy and the inclination to perform such laborious tasks. The larger alembic could hold nearly 3 liters, and it had been used only twice in Ibrahim's memory, both times for the distillation of a complex medicinal liquor that required 7 different botanicals and 3 separate passes through the alembic. The glass of both vessels was covered with a fine layer of dust that had settled over the years, and that Ibrahim saw no reason to disturb. The dust was a protective layer in its own way, cushioning the glass from vibrations and signaling to anyone who might consider using the alembics that they were not to be touched. The shelving unit as a whole represented the accumulated inventory of a lifetime of slow commerce. Nothing in it was new, and nothing in it was unnecessary. Every jar and every bottle and every box had earned its place through years of use, and every substance it contained had been selected because someone in the neighborhood or in the wider city had once needed it and might need it again. The inventory did not change much from year to year. A jar of dried sage might be emptied and refilled with fresh sage from the next harvest. A bottle of rose water might be replaced by a bottle from the same merchant who brought the same copper flask along the same route each year. The sameness was not stagnation but continuity, a quiet reassurance that the world was still operating according to patterns that could be understood and trusted. Ibrahim spent the late morning hours moving slowly along the northern wall, performing the inventory that was not really an inventory, because he already knew what was in each container and how much of it remained and when it would need to be replenished. He lifted lids and peered inside. He tilted jars slightly to assess the level of their contents against the marks he had scratched into the inner walls with the tip of a knife years ago. He sniffed at the openings of certain bottles, not because he doubted their contents, but because the smells were pleasant and familiar, and they confirmed that everything was as it should be. The camphor was still sharp and medicinal. The lavender was still floral and calming. The myrrh was still dark and resinous and ancient. The shop was still a shop, and the day was still a day, and the northern wall with its 47 cubbies and its glass bottles and its ceramic jars and its ox horn spatulas and its copper scales and its copper scales and its silent unused alembics was still the same wall that had greeted Ibrahim every morning for 40 years and would continue to greet him every morning until he closed the heavy cypress door for the final time and let someone else take up the inventory. The wooden mortar sat at the western end of the workbench in a position it had occupied for so long that the oak surface beneath it had developed a shallow circular depression exactly matching the curve of its base. The mortar was made of olive wood harvested from a tree that had grown on a hillside near the town of Bursa, a tree that had been ancient when Ibrahim's grandfather was a boy, and that had finally been felled by a winter storm in the year 1683, the same year that the Ottoman armies had marched on Vienna, though Ibrahim never connected these 2 events in his mind, because one was a matter of history recorded in books, and the other was simply the origin of his favorite tool. The wood had been seasoned for 7 years before the turner shaped it, and for 7 more years after the shaping before old Hager purchased it from a merchant in the Grand Bazaar and brought it to the shop on Akshen Smetin Street, where it had remained ever since. The mortar was a substantial object, heavy enough that Ibrahim had to use both hands and a firm grip to lift it from its resting place. Its exterior dimensions were roughly the size of a large melon, though the shape was more squat and wide than tall, with a flat base that spread outward to provide stability during the grinding motion. The walls were thick, nearly 3 fingers at the rim, and even thicker toward the bottom where the wood had been left deliberately. Massive to absorb the repeated impacts of the pestle without cracking or splintering. The interior cavity was a smooth hemisphere, polished by decades of friction to a surface that felt almost soft to the touch, despite the inherent hardness of the aged olive wood. The color of the wood was a deep golden brown, with darker streaks of grain that swirled through the surface like currents in a slow river, and there were patches where the handling of countless hands over countless years had burnished the exterior to a subtle gleam that caught the light when the afternoon sun reached the western wall. The pestle that accompanied this mortar was made from the same olive wood and had been shaped by the same turner on the same day. It was a club-like object, thicker at the business end and tapering to a narrower handle that fit comfortably into the curve of a human palm. The grinding end was rounded and smooth, having worn down slightly over the decades from its original hemispherical shape to something flatter and broader. A shape that had not been designed but had evolved through the slow accumulation of 10,000 grinding motions. The handle end showed the marks of the turner's chisel, shallow spiral grooves that had once provided grip but had since been worn nearly smooth by the oils and friction of the hands that had held it. The pestle was long enough that when Ibrahim gripped it near the top, his other hand could rest comfortably on the rim of the mortar to steady it, and this length had been chosen deliberately because old Hagup had taught that a pestle that was too short forced the user to hunch, and a hunched back after 40 years of grinding was a misery that no apothecary should have to endure. When the mortar sat empty on the workbench, it made a particular sound if struck gently with the knuckle, a low resonant thump that spoke of density and mass and the absence of any hidden cracks or voids within the wood. This was a sound that Ibrahim produced occasionally, not as a test, because he knew the mortar was sound, but simply as a way of greeting the tool at the start of a day that would involve its use. When the mortar contained something, the sound changed. A handful of dried chamomile flowers produced a muffled rustling sound when the pestle first descended. A measure of hard black peppercorns created a sharp cracking report that echoed off the stone walls. A mass of fibrous marshmallow root yielded a dull squelching noise that Ibrahim found unpleasant, and he always ground the marshmallow root as quickly as efficiency would allow. The rhythm of grinding was a thing that Ibrahim had learned over many years and that he could no longer have explained in words even if someone had asked him. It began with the placement of the material into the bottom of the cavity, followed by a brief pause during which he considered the nature of the substance and adjusted his expectations accordingly. A brittle dried leaf required a different approach than a tough woody root, which required a different approach than a soft oily seed. The pestle was then lowered into the mortar, and the first contact was always gentle, more of a pressing than a grinding, a way of settling the material against the curved bottom so that it would not jump or scatter when the actual work began. Then the motion started. The motion was generated not from the shoulder or the elbow, but from the wrist, a rotation that began at the joint where the hand met the arm and traveled downward through the palm and into the wood of the pestle, and from there into the substance being ground. The pestle moved in a circle around the interior of the mortar, not a perfect geometric circle, but an oval, or perhaps a spiral that gradually tightened toward the center as the material broke down into smaller and smaller particles. The wrist turned and the pestle pressed and scraped, and the substance yielded, and the sound of the work filled the small space of the shop with a steady repetitive noise that was neither loud nor soft, but simply present, as constant as the ticking of a clock or the breathing of a sleeping animal. Ibrahim had learned that grinding too quickly was a common error among apprentices and impatient customers who believed that force and speed could substitute for time and patience. Quick grinding generated heat, and heat was the enemy of volatile oils and delicate aromatics. The friction of wood against herb at high speed could raise the temperature of the material enough to drive off the very compounds that made it valuable, sending them into the air as fragrance that delighted the nose but represented a loss of potency that no amount of careful measuring could recover. Quick grinding also produced an uneven result, a mixture of fine powder and coarse chunks that would not combine properly with honey or oil or whatever binding agent was called for in the recipe. Slow grinding allowed the material to break down gradually, with each particle finding its proper size, and the heat remaining low enough that the essential qualities of the substance were preserved. The olive wood itself contributed to this thermal stability. Wood was a poor conductor of heat compared to stone or metal, and the thick walls of the mortar absorbed and dissipated whatever small warmth was generated by the friction. The wood also had a slight natural oiliness that old olive wood developed over time, a quality that prevented the ground material from sticking to the sides of the cavity and made the cleaning of the mortar a simple matter of wiping with a dry cloth rather than washing with water. Water was never used on the wooden mortar because water raised the grain and swelled the fibers, and over time would cause the wood to crack and split. The dry wiping preserved the smooth polished surface and left behind a microscopic residue of whatever had been ground last. A residue that Ibrahim considered not contamination but seasoning, in the same way that a cook's iron pan was seasoned by the fats and oils of countless meals. The marble mortar sat on a lower shelf of the workbench, a smaller and more specialized tool that Ibrahim employed only for the hardest substances or for materials that might stain or impregnate the porous wood of the larger mortar. The marble was white with faint grey veining, and it had been quarried from an island in the Aegean Sea, whose name Ibrahim had once known, but had since forgotten. The mortar was heavy for its size, denser than the olive wood and cold to the touch, even on the warmest days. Its interior was a perfect hemisphere, polished to a glassy smoothness that reflected the light in the distorted miniature of the shop around it. The pestle that accompanied it was also marble-shaped like a small club, with a flattened bottom that fit precisely into the curve of the mortar's cavity. The marble mortar was used for cinnabar, the bright red mineral that painters ground for vermilion pigment, and that physicians sometimes prescribed for ailments that Ibrahim did not fully understand. It was used for dry gallnuts, the hard round growths that formed on oak trees when certain wasps laid their eggs in the bark, and that produced a dark tannic powder useful for making ink, and for treating leather, and for certain medicinal preparations that required astringency. It was used for rock salt and for dried clay, and for the small hard seeds of the nutmeg when they needed to be reduced to a powder fine enough to pass through a silk sieve. The sound of the marble pestle against the marble mortar was different from the sound of wood on wood, higher pitched and sharper with a ringing quality that seemed to hang in the air for a moment after each impact. Ibrahim did not enjoy this sound, and he used the marble mortar only when necessary and only for as long as necessary. The wooden mortar, in contrast, produced sounds that Ibrahim found deeply satisfying, though he would not have used the word satisfying to describe them if asked. The sounds were simply the sounds of work being done correctly, and that was enough. When grinding dried rosemary leaves, the pestle produced a soft crunching noise like footsteps on dry autumn leaves. When grinding fennel seeds, the sound was a higher-pitched crackling, a rapid series of small pops, as each seed split open under the pressure. When grinding the fibrous roots of the licorice plant, the sound was a low tearing noise that seemed to come from deep within the wood itself. And when the grinding was nearly finished and the material had been reduced to a fine powder that coated the interior of the mortar in a thin, even layer, the sound changed to something so quiet that it was barely audible. A soft shushing like wind through distant trees or the brush of silk against silk. The act of grinding was never rushed in Ibrahim's shop. Customers who came expecting to receive their compound immediately were gently informed that the preparation required time and that they were welcome to wait on the wooden bench outside the shop or to return later in the day. Most customers understood, and those who did not were not the kind of customers Ibrahim wished to cultivate. The grinding was the heart of the apothecary's work, the moment when raw materials became medicine, when plants and minerals and resins were transformed by nothing more than pressure and motion and time into substances that could ease pain or calm the spirit or bring sleep to someone who had not slept well in many nights. To hurry this transformation was to disrespect the materials and the patient and the long tradition of healers who had ground their compounds in mortars made of stone and wood and bronze since the beginning of human memory. The rotation count was a thing that Ibrahim did not consciously track, but that his body knew with the precision of long habit. A handful of dried mint leaves required perhaps 200 rotations to achieve the proper consistency for the tea that the coffeehouse owners purchased in bulk. A measure of black pepper for the kitchen of a wealthy household required 300 rotations to reach the fineness that the cooks demanded. The saffron threads that he would grind later in the day, in combination with the opium resin, would require more rotations than any other substance in the shop. A number that Ibrahim had never written down, but that his wrist and his shoulder and his patience all understood as clearly as they understood the rhythm of his own breathing. The wooden mortar had been in use for so long that it had developed a personality of sorts, or at least a set of characteristics that Ibrahim had come to know as intimately as he knew the creak of his own sleeping platform, or the particular way the morning light fell across the threshold. It had a slight tendency to slide to the left during extended grinding sessions, a quirk caused by an almost imperceptible unevenness in the flatness of its base. Ibrahim compensated for this without thinking, shifting his grip on the rim every dozen rotations to nudge the mortar back toward its proper position. It had a small crack near the rim on the eastern side, a crack that had appeared some 20 years ago and had never grown larger, because Ibrahim had filled it with a paste of beeswax and pine resin that had hardened into a repair stronger than the original wood. The crack did not affect the function of the mortar, and Ibrahim had long since stopped noticing it, except when his thumb passed over the slightly raised line of the repair during the steadying of the vessel. The pestle, too, had its peculiarities. The grinding end had worn slightly asymmetrically over the decades, favoring one side by a fraction of a finger's width. Because Ibrahim was right-handed and the natural motion of his wrist imparted a subtle bias to the pressure. This asymmetry meant that the pestle fit his hand perfectly and would fit the hand of a left-handed user awkwardly, a fact that Ibrahim had discovered once when a left-handed apprentice had attempted to use the tool and had produced a grinding motion that looked uncomfortable and sounded wrong. The handle end had absorbed the oils of Ibrahim's palm so thoroughly that the wood in that section was darker than the rest of the pestle, a patch of deep amber that marked the place where his hand had rested for countless hours over countless years. The cleaning of the wooden mortar after use was a ritual as precise and unhurried as the grinding itself. Ibrahim kept a square of coarse linen cloth folded beside the mortar, and when the grinding was finished and the ground material had been transferred to its waiting container, he would take up the cloth and wipe the interior of the mortar in slow circular motions that followed the same path the pestle had traced during the grinding. The cloth removed the visible residue of the ground substance, but it did not remove the microscopic film that had worked its way into the polished surface of the wood. This film was the history of the mortar, written in a language of scent and chemistry that no one could read, but that everyone could sense when they lifted the vessel to their face and inhaled the faint complex aroma of all the things that had been ground within it over the decades. There was the ghost of cinnamon and the memory of cloves, and the distant echo of dried rose petals, and underneath all of these, the clean, neutral scent of the olive wood itself. The marble mortar was cleaned differently. After use, it was rinsed with a small amount of water from the courtyard well, and then wiped dry with a different cloth, a soft linen that left no fibers behind on the polished stone. The water carried away the fine white dust of the marble that had been abraded during the grinding, along with whatever substance had been processed, and this slurry was poured onto the roots of the fig tree in the courtyard, where it joined the other offerings that Ibrahim made to the tree without any conscious intention of doing so. The marble mortar was then returned to its shelf, where it would wait in the cool darkness until the next time a hard seed or a staining mineral required its particular services. The wooden mortar returned to its depression in the oak workbench, and the pestle was laid across its mouth, a position that protected the interior cavity from settling dust, while allowing the wood to breathe. In this configuration, the two objects formed a shape that was pleasing to the eye. The horizontal line of the pestle crossing the circular opening of the mortar, creating a composition that Ibrahim had looked upon so many times that he no longer saw it as anything other than the natural state of his workspace. The tools were ready. They had done their work, and they would do it again tomorrow or later in the same day, depending on what customers requested. For now they rested in the quiet of the afternoon, a quiet that was broken only by the distant cry of a vendor and the soft scrape of Mustafa's broom on the cobblestones and the occasional flutter of wings as a pigeon passed by the oiled parchment window on its way to somewhere else. The afternoon of the day when the saffron shipment arrived was warm in the way that autumn afternoons in Constantinople often were, with a sun that still held the memory of summer but a breeze that carried the first whispers of the cold that would come. The light in the shop had shifted from the pale gold of morning to a deeper amber that pooled on the floor in longer rectangles and climbed higher on the northern wall, illuminating the dust motes that drifted in the still air. Ibrahim had spent the hours since his inventory of the shelves performing small tasks that required no particular concentration. He had wiped the rim of the ceramic mortar with the dry cloth. He had adjusted the position of the blue jars by the door, though they had not moved since he adjusted them in the morning. He had sat on the three-legged stool and looked at nothing in particular, and listened to the sounds of the street, which had changed from the early quiet of sweeping and shutter opening to the midday murmur of conversations and the clatter of cartwheels and the occasional bray of a donkey. The arrival of the Greek sea captain's mate was announced not by a knock on the door, for the door stood open as it always did during the daylight hours, but by a shadow that fell across the threshold and remained there. The shadow belonged to a man of middle height and sturdy build, wearing the simple clothing of a sailor on shore, a loose shirt of coarse linen and trousers of heavy canvas and a leather cap that had been bleached by salt and sun to a color that was no longer brown, but not yet grey. His face was weathered and his hands were thick and calloused, and he carried a small parcel wrapped in waxed linen and tied with hemp twine that had been knotted in a particular way that Ibrahim recognized as the knot used by the customs officials at the Galata house. The mate did not enter the shop, but stood in the doorway with the patience of a man who had spent many hours waiting for tides and winds and the decisions of captains. He held the parcel out in front of him with both hands as if it were something fragile or valuable, or both. Ibrahim rose from the stool and crossed the floor with his measured step, and took the parcel without speaking, because the transaction had been arranged weeks earlier through the merchant who supplied the shop with goods from the eastern trade routes, and there was nothing to discuss. The mate nodded once, a small movement of his chin that might have meant anything or nothing, and then he turned and walked away down Smitten Street in the direction of the harbour from which he had come. Ibrahim watched him go for a moment, noting the slight roll in his gait that marked a man who had spent more time on the deck of a ship than on solid ground, and then he turned back into the shop and carried the parcel to the workbench. The parcel was small, no larger than a man's closed fist, and it weighed almost nothing. The waxed linen that wrapped it was a pale brown color, stiffened by the wax that had been brushed onto its surface to protect the contents from the damp air of the sea voyage. The hemp twine was wound around the parcel 3 times in each direction, forming a cross pattern that held the linen tight against whatever lay inside. The knot at the center was the kind of knot that could only be untied by someone who knew its secret, a loop that had to be pulled in a particular direction to release the tension that held the whole arrangement secure. Ibrahim knew this knot because he had received parcels tied in this way from the customs house at Galata many times over the years, and his fingers found the correct loop without conscious thought, and pulled, and the knot came apart, and the twine fell away in a loose coil onto the workbench. The waxed linen was folded rather than cut, and Ibrahim unfolded it carefully, lifting one corner and then another, and then peeling back the final layer to reveal the contents. Inside there was a second wrapping, this one made of thin paper that had been imported from Damascus, a paper that was smooth and pale and slightly translucent, and that rustled with a sound like dry leaves when touched. The paper was folded into a small flat packet and sealed with a drop of red wax that bore the imprint of the merchant's seal, a design of a ship under sail surrounded by writing in Arabic script that Ibrahim could not read but recognized as the mark of the house of Al-Khari, which had been trading in spices and medicinals for 4 generations. He broke the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the paper, and there inside, nested in a bed of raw cotton wool that had been teased apart into a soft cloud of white fibers, were the saffron threads. The threads were exactly as they should have been. They were deep red in color, a red that was almost burgundy in the shadows of the shop, but that flared into something brighter and more vivid when a shaft of afternoon light fell across them, a red like the petals of a certain poppy that grew wild in the fields of Anatolia, or like the glaze on a piece of Iznik pottery that had been fired in a kiln that burned olive wood. Each thread was a single dried stigma of the crocus sativus flower, and each thread was slightly curled at the ends and slightly flattened along its length, and each thread was distinct and separate from its neighbors because proper saffron was never compressed or packed tightly for fear of breaking the delicate structures that contained its precious oils. The aroma that rose from the opened packet was the true test of quality, and Ibrahim lowered his face toward the saffron and inhaled slowly through his nose. The scent was complex and layered, and it spoke of the place where the flowers had grown, somewhere in the high valleys of Persia, or perhaps in the fields near the town of Safranbolu, which had taken its name from the spice and had once supplied the entire empire with its harvest. There was a note of hay dried in the sun until it was golden and sweet. There was a note of honey, not the thick amber honey of the beehives on the Prince's Islands, but a lighter floral honey that came from bees that had fed on wild thyme and clover. And underneath these pleasant, familiar scents, there was something else, a faint metallic edge that was not unpleasant, but rather intriguing, a hint of copper or perhaps of iron that gave the saffron its distinctive character and that separated the true crocus sativus from the inferior substitutes the dishonest merchants sometimes trying to sell to the unwary. Ibrahim reached into the packet with his thumb and forefinger and pinched a single thread, lifting it free of the cotton wool and holding it up to the light that came through the oiled parchment window. The thread was translucent at its edges, where the red faded to a pale orange and the light passing through it took on a golden quality, as if the sun itself had been trapped inside the tiny filament of dried plant matter. He rolled the thread gently between his fingers, feeling the slight resistance of the dried stigma, the way it bent without breaking, and then returned to its original shape when released. A good saffron thread was pliable, not brittle, and it left a faint stain on the skin, a yellow-orange mark that was the color of the precious Croatian compound that gave the spice both its color and its value. The yellow stain on his fingertips pleased Ibrahim in a quiet way. It was the mark of authenticity, a sign that the merchant had sent what he had promised and that the long journey from the fields where the flowers were picked adorned by women whose fingers moved with the speed of long practice across the dusty roads to the caravanserais where the camels rested and onward to the port at Iskenderun or perhaps Trabzon, and then over the sea on a Greek trading vessel that had stopped at Rhodes and Chios, and then over the Sea of Marmara, and finally to the customs house, again completed, without damage or loss, edged because the stain would fade from his fingers in a day or two, washed away by the water of the courtyard well and the friction of his daily tasks. But for now, it was a small badge of his trade, a sign that he had handled the most precious spice in the world, and that he knew how to judge its quality. The quantity of saffron in the packet was modest, perhaps 3 drams by weight, though Ibrahim would measure it precisely on the copper scales before recording it in his ledger. 3 drams was enough to last for several months, of the kind of careful measured use that characterized his practice, because saffron was never used in large amounts. A pinch was sufficient to color and flavor an entire dish of rice for a wedding feast. A single thread crushed between the fingers and steeped in hot water could make a tea that was believed to lift the spirits and ease the discomforts of the monthly courses. The compound that he would prepare later, combining the saffron with the opium resin, required only a small amount of the spice, enough to give the mixture its characteristic golden hue, and to contribute whatever subtle properties the saffron possessed to the final preparation. The transfer of the saffron from the paper packet to its permanent home in the Chinese porcelain jar was an operation that Ibrahim performed with the same unhurried precision that he applied to all his tasks. He crossed to the northern wall and reached up to the cedar-shelved section and lifted down the porcelain jar with both hands. The jar was cool to the touch, and its white surface gleamed softly in the dim light of the shop. The blue-painted vines that twisted around its circumference had been applied by a hand that had belonged to a potter in the city of Jingdezhen, a potter who had lived and died in a country so distant that Ibrahim could not have found it on a map, even if he had possessed one. The jar had travelled farther than any other object in the shop, farther even than the ambergris that had floated across entire oceans before washing up on a beach in the Maldives. It had come by riverboat, and by camel caravan, and by trading ship, and by cart, and by the hands of countless merchants and porters and customs officials, until it had arrived on the shelf in Ibrahim's shop, where it held the saffron and nothing else. He removed the fitted lid of the jar, a disc of the same white porcelain with a small knob on top that was painted with a single blue flower. The interior of the jar was clean and dry, and smelled faintly of the saffron that had previously occupied it, a ghost of a scent that lingered in the porous ceramic and would never be entirely washed away. He set the lid aside on the workbench and returned the paper packet and began the process of transferring the threads one by one from the cotton wool to the jar. This was not a process that could be hurried. The threads were fragile and they tended to cling to one another, and to the cotton wool, and to the paper, and to the fingers that handled them. Ibrahim used the smallest of the ox-horn spatulas, the one no longer than his little finger, and no wider than a grain of wheat, to gently separate the threads and lift them from their nest. The spatula slid beneath a small cluster of threads, and Ibrahim raised it carefully, bringing the threads up into the light, and then tilting the spatula so that they slid off the smooth horn and down into the darkness of the porcelain jar. The motion was repeated again and again, each time with a small cluster of threads, each time with the same careful attention to the angle of the spatula and the speed of the descent. The threads that fell into the jar made no sound as they landed. They were too light and the distance was too short, and they simply settled onto the growing pile at the bottom of the jar with a silence that was appropriate to their value and their delicacy. The pile grew, slowly accumulating thread by thread and cluster by cluster, and Ibrahim watched it grow with the satisfaction of a man who was building something that would last. The deep red of the saffron against the white interior of the porcelain created a contrast that was pleasing to the eye, a small beauty that no one but Ibrahim would ever see, because the jar was kept on a high shelf and was opened only when saffron was needed, and was otherwise left undisturbed in the cool darkness. When the transfer was complete, Ibrahim inspected the paper packet and the cotton wool to ensure that no threads remained behind. He found 2 small fragments caught in the fibers of the cotton, and he retrieved them with the tip of the spatula and added them to the jar. The paper he folded carefully and placed in the drawer beneath the workbench, where it would be used later for wrapping some other small item for a customer. The cotton wool he returned to a larger bundle of raw cotton that he kept in a ceramic jar on the bottom shelf, material that would be used again the next time a precious shipment arrived. The porcelain jar was now perhaps 3/4 full, a quantity that represented a significant portion of Ibrahim's total wealth, though he did not think of it in those terms. He thought of it as a supply of saffron that would last through the winter and into the spring, and that would allow him to prepare the compounds that his customers requested and to sell small pinches to the cooks and the households who came to his door, seeking the spice for their special occasions. He replaced the lid on the jar, pressing it down until it seated firmly, and then he carried the jar back to its place on the cedar shelf, where it would wait in the cool northern shadow until it was needed. The afternoon light had continued its slow migration across the floor and the walls, and now it touched the edge of the workbench where the wooden mortar sat in its circular depression. The shop was quiet again, the brief interruption of the sailor's visit having passed like a ripple on the surface of a still pond, leaving behind no trace except the faint aroma of saffron that hung in the air, and the yellow stain on Ibrahim's fingertips, and the porcelain jar on its shelf that was now slightly fuller than it had been an hour before. Ibrahim returned to the 3-legged stool and sat down and allowed his breathing to settle into its usual slow rhythm. The saffron was safe. The transaction was complete. The day continued in its unhurried course toward the evening call to prayer and the closing of the heavy cypress door and the return of darkness to the shop on Zametin Street. The opium that Ibrahim would later combine with the saffron had arrived at the shop some 6 weeks earlier in a shipment that had come overland from the town of Afyonkarahisar, a place whose name meant opium black castle and whose fields produced the finest poppy resin in all of the Ottoman domains. The journey from that high Anatolian plain to the narrow street of Zametin had taken 11 days by mule cart, traveling along roads that were dusty in the dry season and muddy in the wet, and that passed through villages whose names Ibrahim had heard from the carter but had not bothered to remember. The cart had carried many things besides opium. There were sacks of dried apricots and bundles of raw wool, and clay pots filled with a kind of soft cheese that was made only in that region, and that the carter sold to a merchant in the bazaar before coming to the apothecary shop. The opium was a small part of the cargo in terms of volume, but a significant part in terms of value, and the carter had kept the package wrapped in oiled leather and hidden beneath a false bottom in one of the wooden crates, a precaution that was not strictly necessary because the trade in opium was entirely legal and properly taxed, but that reflected the carters' general distrust of the roads and the people who travelled them. The package, when it was finally unwrapped on the workbench in the shop, had contained 3 bricks of raw opium, each one roughly the size of a man's palm, and each one weighing approximately 100 dirhams by the apothecary's measure. The bricks were not bricks in the sense of fired clay or cut stone, but rather masses of a dark resinous substance that had been pressed into rough rectangular shapes while still soft, and then allowed to dry and harden in the open air of the Anatolian summer. Each brick was wrapped in a poppy leaf, the same kind of leaf that had once shaded the flower head from which the latex had been collected. A leaf that was now dried and brown and brittle, but that still held the shape of the resin it enclosed and still carried a faint vegetal scent that was distinct from the heavier odor of the opium itself. The appearance of the raw opium was something that Ibrahim had seen many times over the decades, and it never failed to hold his attention for a few moments when a new shipment arrived. The surface of the bricks was dark, a color that was not quite brown and not quite black, but somewhere in between, a deep umber that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was not smooth like glass or polished stone, but had a slight texture, a fine graininess that was visible when the brick was held close to the light, and that came from the tiny particles of plant material and dust that had become incorporated into the latex during the collection process. The edges of the bricks were rounded and uneven, where the soft resin had been pressed by the hands of the farmer who had gathered it, and the corners had darkened further over time as the outer layer of the resin oxidized in the air. The weight of a brick of opium was surprising to someone who had never handled one before. A brick that fit comfortably in the palm of the hand, felt heavier than its size, suggested a density that came from the concentration of the latex and from the long, slow drying that had driven off the water content but left behind all the complex compounds that gave the resin its properties. Ibrahim had held enough bricks of opium in his hands over the years that he no longer noticed the weight as unusual, but he remembered the first time he had lifted one as a young apprentice and the small shock of its unexpected heaviness, a feeling like holding a piece of lead that had been painted to look like dried fruit. The smell of raw opium was the most reliable indicator of its quality, and Ibrahim had learned to judge a shipment by this sense more than by any other. The odor was complex and difficult to describe in words, a fact that had never troubled Ibrahim because he had no need to describe it to anyone else. There was a deep earthy note that reminded him of the forest floor after a rain, though the poppy fields of Afyonkarahisar were not forested, but open plains of dry soil and low scrub. There was a bitter component that registered at the back of the throat rather than in the nose, a sharpness that was not unpleasant, but that announced the presence of the alkaloids that gave the resin its value. And underneath these there was a faint sweetness, a floral hint that was the ghost of the poppy flower itself, a pale purple bloom that had opened for only a few days before dropping its petals and leaving behind the swelling capsule that would be scored with a special knife to release the precious white latex. The scoring of the poppy capsules was an art that Ibrahim had never witnessed in person, but that he had heard described in detail by the carter who brought the shipments. The farmer would rise before dawn and walk through the fields with a small curved knife that had several blades bound together so that multiple parallel cuts could be made with a single stroke. The knife would be drawn across the surface of the green capsule, cutting through the outer skin but not penetrating deeply enough to damage the seeds inside. The cuts would ooze a white milky latex that would slowly seep out and coagulate on the surface of the capsule, turning from white to pink to brown as it oxidized in the morning air. Later in the day, the farmer would return with a flat scraping tool and would carefully collect the now darkened latex from each capsule, depositing it into a small container that hung from his belt. The process would be repeated over several days as the capsules continued to produce latex until they were spent and the plants were left to dry in the sun before the seeds were harvested for the next year's planting. The 3 bricks that had arrived in the shipment were of varying quality, a fact that Ibrahim had noted in his ledger with small marks beside each entry. The best brick was the one that had come from a farmer named Mehmet, whose fields lay on a south-facing slope that received the full sun throughout the growing season. This brick was slightly softer than the others, more pliable when warmed in the hand, and its color was a richer, deeper brown, with fewer pale streaks or inclusions. The second brick was adequate of standard quality and suitable for the majority of the compounds that Ibrahim prepared. The third brick was somewhat inferior, having been harvested late in the season from capsules that were already beginning to dry, and it would be used for preparations that did not require the finest grade of resin or that would be combined with other strong flavored ingredients that would mask any slight deficiencies. The storage of opium required the same cool, dark conditions that preserved the saffron, and for the same reasons. Heat drove off the volatile compounds and light degraded the complex molecules that gave the resin its character. Ibrahim kept the opium bricks in a wooden box that had been carved from a single block of cedar and fitted with a tight-fitting lid that excluded both light and insects. The box sat on the bottom shelf of the northern wall in the coolest and most stable corner of the shop, and it was never opened except when Ibrahim needed to remove a portion of resin for the preparation of a compound. The box had been made by a carpenter in the Jewish quarter of Balat, a man whose family had been working wood for so many generations that they had forgotten when they had first arrived in Constantinople, and the cedar had come from the mountains of Lebanon by way of the same trade routes that brought the spices and the silks and the other precious things of the East. Inside the cedar box, the three bricks lay side by side, separated by thin sheets of oiled paper that prevented them from sticking to one another or to the wood of the box. The paper had been brushed with linseed oil and allowed to dry until it was no longer tacky, and it formed a barrier that was impermeable to the sticky resin while being itself inert and harmless. The bricks had settled during their weeks in the box and had flattened slightly on their bottom surfaces, conforming to the level floor of the container, and this slight change in shape was the only evidence that the resin was not entirely solid, but retained a slow fluidity that operated on a timescale too long for human perception. When Ibrahim needed to use a portion of opium, he would remove the entire brick from the box and place it on the workbench on a square of the same oiled paper. The brick would be cool from its storage and relatively hard, and it would hold its shape when handled, though a firm press of the thumb would leave a slight indentation that slowly filled in over the course of several minutes. The hardness of the resin varied with the temperature of the room and with the specific brick, and with the age of the material, older opium becoming harder and more brittle as the last traces of moisture and volatile oils evaporated over the years. The brick that Ibrahim planned to use for the compound with the saffron was the best one, the one from the farm of Mehmet on the south-facing slope, and it had aged in the cedar box for 6 weeks, a period that had allowed it to stabilize without losing any of its desirable qualities. The preparation of the opium for grinding required a preliminary step that Ibrahim performed with the same unhurried care that characterized all his work. The resin in its raw state was too sticky and too cohesive to be ground effectively in the wooden mortar. It would cling to the pestle and ball up into a mass that resisted breaking down, and the friction would generate heat that would soften the resin further and make it even more difficult to work. The solution to this problem was a technique that old Haggip had taught Ibrahim during his apprenticeship, and that Ibrahim had refined over the decades of his practice. Before grinding, the opium would be combined with a measured amount of gum arabic, a dried exudate from the acacia trees that grew in the land south of Egypt, and that had been traded along the Red Sea and the Nile and the Mediterranean since the time of the pharaohs. The gum arabic that Ibrahim kept in the shop came in the form of small irregular pieces that ranged in color from pale amber to deep golden brown. The pieces were hard and brittle, and they shattered into sharp fragments when struck with the marble pestle in the marble mortar, a task that Ibrahim had performed the day before in anticipation of the opium preparation. The shattered gum had then been ground further until it was a fine powder that passed through a silk sieve and collected in a small ceramic bowl, where it waited on the workbench like a pile of pale sand. The powder had no strong odor, only a faint sweetness that was barely detectable, and it dissolved readily in water to form a mucilage that was useful for binding pills and lozenges and for thickening certain medicinal syrups. In the case of the opium compound, the gum arabic served a different purpose. It would absorb the sticky oils of the resin and coat the particles of opium as they were ground, allowing them to separate and break down rather than clumping together. The proportion of gum arabic to opium was a matter of experience rather than precise measurement, though Ibrahim used the copper scales to weigh both substances before combining them. For the amount of opium that he planned to prepare, a piece roughly the size of a walnut shell and weighing approximately 12 dirhams, he would add 3 dirhams of the powdered gum, a ratio of 4:1 that had proven over many years to produce the optimal consistency for grinding. The opium was cut from the brick using a thin-bladed knife that Ibrahim kept exclusively for this purpose, a knife with a handle of carved bone and a blade of Damascus steel that held an edge sharp enough to slice through the dense resin without tearing or crushing it. The knife had been a gift from a Syrian merchant who had once purchased a significant quantity of a compound for a chronic ailment that had troubled him for years, and who had insisted on giving Ibrahim something in return, despite the apothecary's protests that payment had already been made in coin. The cut piece of opium was placed in the wooden mortar, and the powdered gum arabic was sprinkled over it in a thin, even layer that coated the surface of the dark resin. The combination of the two substances created a visual contrast that Ibrahim always paused to observe for a moment, the deep brown of the opium against the pale gold of the gum, like the colors of earth and sand seen from a distance. Then he took up the olive wood pestle and began the grinding. The first contact of the pestle with the opium was always a moment of transition. The resin was firm but not hard, and it yielded under the pressure of the wood in a way that was different from the way dried herbs or seeds yielded. It was a slight give, a softness that was almost organic, as if the material remembered that it had once been alive. The gum arabic powder crunched softly as the pestle pressed it against the surface of the opium, and then the two substances began to combine under the slow rotation of the pestle against the mortar. The sound of opium being ground was unlike any other sound in the apothecary's repertoire. It was a low, muffled noise, a kind of dull grinding that had no sharp edges and no high frequencies. The gum arabic prevented the resin from sticking to the wood, and instead the opium began to break down into smaller and smaller fragments, each one coated with a fine layer of the pale powder. The mixture gradually changed color as the grinding progressed, the dark brown of the pure opium lightening to a warmer shade as the gum arabic was incorporated, a color that reminded Ibrahim of the leather bindings on certain old books in the library of the mosque near the Bayezid complex, though he had seen those books only once, many years ago. The consistency of the mixture was the thing that Ibrahim monitored most closely during the grinding. Too much gum arabic would produce a dry, crumbly powder that would not hold together when pressed into the final form. Too little gum would result in a sticky mass that would cling to the pestle and the sides of the mortar and would require additional time and effort to work into a uniform texture. The correct proportion produced a material that was slightly moist to the touch, but not wet, a fine granular powder that would compress into a solid when squeezed in the palm and then crumble again when released. This was the consistency that Ibrahim sought, and that his hands knew how to achieve without conscious calculation. The grinding continued for many minutes, with Ibrahim's wrist turning in the familiar oval pattern and the pestle tracing its path around the interior of the wooden mortar. The sound of the work was a soft, constant presence in the shop, a sound that would have been inaudible to anyone standing on the street outside, but that filled the small space with a rhythm that was as regular as breathing. The mixture in the mortar grew finer and more uniform with each rotation, and the color became a consistent warm brown that showed no streaks of pure opium or pockets of unmixed gum. When the grinding was complete, Ibrahim stopped the motion of the pestle and let it rest against the side of the mortar. He leaned forward and examined the mixture closely, bringing his face near enough to smell the combined aroma of opium and gum arabic. The scent was different from the raw opium, having been softened and complicated by the addition of the gum. The sharp, bitter note was still present, but it was now balanced by the faint sweetness of the acacia exudate, and by the clean, neutral smell of the olive wood that had contributed its own subtle character to the mixture. Through the friction of the grinding, the material in the bottom of the mortar was a fine, uniform powder that would later be combined with the saffron, and with a small amount of honey to create the final compound that was requested by the physicians and the wealthy households and the occasional traveler who had heard of Ibrahim's skill from someone who had purchased from him in the past. He used the medium-sized ox-horn spatula to transfer the ground mixture from the mortar to a small ceramic bowl that he kept covered with a square of linen. The spatula scraped the curved interior of the mortar clean, leaving behind only the faintest residue that would be removed later with the dry cloth during the cleaning ritual. The bowl was placed on the workbench, where it would wait until the saffron had been prepared, and the two precious ingredients could be brought together in the final stage of the compound. The remaining brick of opium sat on the square of oiled paper where Ibrahim had left it, and he now rewrapped it carefully and returned it to the cedar box alongside its two companions. The lid of the box was pressed firmly into place, and the box was returned to its corner on the bottom shelf, where the cool darkness would preserve the resin until the next time a portion was required. The smell of opium lingered in the air of the shop, a faint bitter sweetness that would dissipate slowly over the course of the afternoon, mixing with the other scents that inhabited the space, the chamomile and the mint and the lavender, and the ghost of saffron that still clung to the porcelain jar on its high shelf. The work of preparing the opium was complete, and the day moved forward in its slow measured way toward the hour when the saffron would be ground and the two substances would meet in the wooden mortar for the final time. The hour after the midday call to prayer was the quietest hour in Constantinople. The city did not sleep in the way that a person sleeps, but it entered a state of suspension, a collective pause that was observed by shopkeepers and craftsmen and street vendors, and even the animals that inhabited the narrow lanes and courtyards. The sun had climbed to its highest point in the pale autumn sky, and now it hung there seemingly motionless, while the shadows beneath the eaves and awnings shrank to their smallest dimensions of the day. The light that fell on Achnemsetin Street was white and hard, and it bleached the color from the cobblestones and the wooden balconies and the faces of the few people who still moved about their business. The heat was not oppressive as it would have been in July or August, but it was present a warmth that gathered in the enclosed spaces and radiated from the stone walls that had been absorbing the sun since dawn. Ibrahim had finished the grinding of the opium and gum Arabic mixture, and he had cleaned the wooden mortar with the dry cloth and returned the pestle to its resting position across the mouth of the vessel. The ceramic bowl containing the ground preparation sat on the workbench covered with its square of linen, and it would remain there undisturbed until the time came to add the saffron. That time was not now. The afternoon had entered its long, slow middle passage, and there was nothing that required Ibrahim's immediate attention. And so he did what he had done on 10,000 afternoons before this one. He sat on the three-legged stool, and he did nothing. The stool was positioned near the workbench, but slightly to one side, so that Ibrahim could see through the open doorway and into the street beyond. The view from this spot was limited, a narrow slice of Achnemsetin Street, framed by the wooden doorposts and the overhanging eaves of the shop. He could see the front of the building, opposite a wall of rough plaster that had been whitewashed many years ago, and had since faded to a soft grey marked with patches of damp and the faint outlines of old repairs. He could see a section of the cobblestones, perhaps 10 paces of them, before the street curved gently to the left and disappeared behind the corner of the spice merchant's shop. He could see the edge of the spice merchant's awning, a strip of faded blue canvas that hung motionless in the still air, and he could see the shadow of the Valens aqueduct, a dark stripe that fell across the upper part of the street where the ancient Roman arches passed over the valley between the third and fourth hills of the city. The aqueduct had been built more than 1,300 years before this afternoon in the year 1725 by an emperor whose name Ibrahim did not know, and whose face he had never seen depicted on a coin or a painting. The structure brought water to the city from the forests of the north, carrying it along a channel of stone and mortar that ran for miles across the Thracian countryside, and then soared over the valley on 2 tiers of arches that had survived earthquakes and sieges and the slow erosion of time. The shadow of the aqueduct was a constant presence in this part of the city, moving across the rooftops and the streets as the sun travels from east to west, marking the hours in a way that was older and more permanent than any clock. In the quietest hour of the afternoon, the shadow lay directly over Achnemsetin Street, a band of cool darkness that was exactly the width of the aqueduct's upper tier. Inside that band of shadow, something was sleeping. A tabby cat of no particular distinction had found the wedge of coolness where the aqueduct's shadow met the base of the wall opposite Ibrahim's shop. The cat was the same cat that slept in this spot on most afternoons, a creature of indeterminate ownership that belonged to the street rather than to any specific household. Its fur was a mixture of grey and brown and pale orange, arranged in stripes and swirls that served no purpose except to make the cat look exactly like 1,000 other cats that lived in the streets of Constantinople. Its eyes were closed and its body was curled into a compact shape, with its tail wrapped around its nose and its paws tucked beneath its chest. The rise and fall of its breathing was visible even from across the street, a slow, gentle motion that was the only movement in the entire scene. The cat was not the only living thing in the street, but it was the only one that Ibrahim could see. The spice merchant had closed his shutters for the afternoon rest period, a custom that was observed by most of the shopkeepers in this quarter of the city. The sound of Mustafa's broom had faded hours ago, and the street sweeper had retired to whatever corner or courtyard he inhabited when he was not pushing his bundle of twigs across the cobblestones. The vendors who sold simit and fresh figs and cups of cool sherbet had moved to other streets where the afternoon traffic might still provide a customer or two, or they had found their own patches of shade and were dozing with their backs against the walls. The city of nearly 500,000 souls had not fallen silent, but it had lowered its voice to a murmur that was barely audible in the narrow lane of Ashnim Satin. Ibrahim sat on his stool and looked at the cat and the shadow and the empty street, and his mind, if it could be called a mind in these moments, did not think in words or sentences or anything that could be captured and written down. His awareness was simply present in the shop and in the afternoon, and in the slow passage of the dust motes through the shaft of light that came through the oiled parchment window. The dust motes were the only things in the shop that moved with any purpose or direction. They drifted upward and downward and sideways, following currents of air that were too subtle to be felt on the skin currents created by the warmth of the sun on the roof tiles, and the coolness of the stone floor, and the slow exhalation of Ibrahim's own breathing. The motes were tiny fragments of everything that had ever been in the shop, dried leaves and powdered roots and fibers from the wool of Ibrahim's vest and flakes of skin that had shed from his hands as he worked. They floated in the golden light, and they sparkled briefly when they passed through the brightest part of the beam, and then they faded back into the dimmer regions of the shop, where they became invisible again. The Tulip Era was the name that later historians would give to this period of the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, a span of years from roughly 1718 to 1730, when the Ottoman court and the wealthy classes of Constantinople had turned their attention away from warfare and territorial expansion and toward the pleasures of gardens and poetry and the cultivation of beauty. The tulip had become the symbol of this age, a flower that had originated in the mountains of Central Asia and had traveled westward through the gardens of Persia and the courts of Vienna and the trading houses of Holland before returning to the Ottoman capital in new and extravagant varieties. The Sultan himself was said to possess a collection of more than 1,000 distinct tulip cultivizers, each one documented in a painted manuscript, and each one celebrated in verse by the poets who gathered at the palace for the evening illuminations. But the Tulip Era, as it was experienced in a small apothecary shop on Akşinsmetin Street, had nothing to do with illuminated gardens or poetry recitals, or the extravagant parties that were thrown by the Grand Vizier in the pavilions along the Bosphorus. The Tulip Era in Ibrahim's shop was the quiet of the afternoon, and the sound of the wooden mortar and the smell of saffron and opium, and the patient waiting for customers who might or might not come. The grand events of the age passed over the roof of the shop like clouds moving across the sky, visible if one bothered to look up, but irrelevant to the daily work of grinding and measuring and compounding. Ibrahim had never seen the Sultan's tulip gardens, and he had never attended an illumination party, and he had never read a single line of the poetry that was written in praise of the flower. His experience of the Tulip Era was this: the slow breathing of a sleeping cat in the shadow of a Roman aqueduct on a warm autumn afternoon in the year 1725. The building in which the shop was housed was old even by the standards of Constantinople, a city that had been accumulating buildings for more than 1,000 years. The lower walls were stone blocks that had been cut and fitted during the Byzantine period, and they still bore the marks of the masons who had shaped them with chisels and hammers in a time when the city was called Constantinople by everyone and the emperor ruled from the great palace on the eastern tip of the peninsula. The upper walls were a later addition built of timber and brick during the Ottoman centuries, when the city had grown upward rather than outward, and the old Roman streets had been narrowed by the encroachment of wooden balconies and overhanging upper stories. The building creaked and settled constantly in response to changes in temperature and humidity, a living sound that was as much a part of the shop as the smell of dried herbs or the gleam of the copper scales. In the quietest hour of the afternoon, these creaks and settlings were more audible than at any other time. The warmth of the sun on the roof caused the wooden beams to expand by tiny increments, and the expansion caused the joints to shift, and the shifting produced soft groans and clicks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A beam that ran across the ceiling above the workbench made a sound like a long, slow exhalation, a sigh of wood that had been holding its breath since the morning and was now releasing it into the warm, still air. A floorboard near the door made a sharp click as it adjusted to the weight of the sunlight that had been pressing on it for hours. The old plaster on the northern wall released a fine shower of dust, so fine that it was indistinguishable from the dust motes already floating in the air, a small cascade of particles that settled onto the lids of the ceramic jars and the shoulders of the glass bottles and the surface of the workbench, where it would be wiped away the next morning as part of the daily ritual. Ibrahim heard these sounds and did not hear them in the way that a person hears a voice or a bell. They were simply the background of his existence, the acoustic texture of a life spent in this particular building on this particular street. He did not startle when a beam groaned, or look up when a floorboard clicked. His body had learned long ago to filter these sounds into the category of things that required no response, a category that included most of the sounds of the city and most of the sounds of the shop and most of the sounds of the world outside the heavy cypress door. The cat in the shadow of the aqueduct shifted in its sleep. One ear twitched and then settled back against the skull. A hind leg extended slowly and then retracted, the tail uncurled from around the nose, and then curled again in a slightly different configuration. These movements were performed without waking the animal in the same way that Ibrahim's breathing continued, without his conscious direction. The cat was dreaming, whatever dreams cats dream, perhaps of mice in the granaries behind the bakeries, or of warm patches of sunlight on the rooftops, or of nothing at all. Its sleep was deep and undisturbed, and it would continue in this state until the shadow of the aqueduct moved on and the sun reached the spot where it lay. The movement of the aqueduct's shadow was imperceptible in the moment, but inevitable over the course of the afternoon. The earth turned, and the sun appeared to move across the sky, and the shadow crept across the cobblestones at a pace that could not be seen, but could be measured. In an hour, the dark band would have shifted by the width of a man's hand. In 2 hours, it would have moved enough to expose the cat to the full warmth of the afternoon sun, and the cat would wake and stretch and relocate to a new patch of shade farther along the wall. This had happened on the previous afternoon and on the afternoon before that, and it would happen on the afternoon to come, and the cat accepted this rhythm in the same way that Ibrahim accepted the rhythm of the grinding and the sweeping and the opening and the sweeping and the opening and closing of the heavy door. The light inside the shop changed more slowly than the shadow outside. The oiled parchment window diffused the sunlight and spread it into a soft glow that filled the front room without creating sharp contrasts or hard edges. The rectangle of light that had fallen across the threshold in the morning had long since retreated, and now the floor was a uniform dimness, broken only by the faint gleam of the copper scales and the pale surface of the marble mortar on its shelf. The jars on the northern wall were visible as dark shapes against the pale plaster, their colors muted by the low light. The Chinese porcelain jar on its high shelf was a ghost of white and blue, barely discernible in the shadows near the ceiling. The whole shop seemed to have settled into itself, to have drawn inward like a creature preparing for a long rest. Ibrahim's eyes adjusted to the dimness without effort. He had spent so many hours in this light that his pupils knew exactly how wide to open, and his brain knew exactly how to interpret the signals they sent. He could see the grain of the wood in the workbench, and the curve of the pestle resting across the mortar, and the small ceramic bowl covered with its square of linen. He could see the faint yellow stain on his fingertips that remained from the saffron inspection earlier in the day. He could see the edge of the ledger book protruding from the drawer beneath the workbench where it waited for the evening entry that would record the grinding of the opium mixture and the preparation for the compound that would be completed the next day or the day after, depending on the arrival of a particular ingredient that was not yet in his possession. The ingredient that was missing was nothing more than a measure of good honey from the hives on the Prince's Islands, a honey that was pale and floral and that would serve as the binding agent for the final compound. Ibrahim had ordered this honey from a beekeeper who made the crossing from the islands once each month, bringing his jars and his wax and his propolis to the markets on the mainland. The beekeeper was due to arrive in 3 days if the weather held and the sea remained calm and the ferrymen were willing to make the crossing. If the weather turned, or the sea grew rough, or the ferrymen decided to wait for better conditions, the honey would arrive later. This was not a matter of concern. The ground opium mixture would keep in its covered bowl for weeks without losing any of its potency, and the saffron would wait in its porcelain jar for months or years, and the compound itself was not urgently required by any customer. It was simply a preparation that Ibrahim made at regular intervals to replenish the small supply that he kept in a locked drawer for those who came seeking it. The quiet of the afternoon was so complete that Ibrahim could hear his own heartbeat if he listened for it, a soft, regular thump that was felt more than heard, a pressure in the chest and a faint pulse in the temples. His breathing was slow and shallow, the breathing of a body at rest that required very little oxygen to maintain its functions. His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, fingers slightly curled in the position they naturally assumed when not engaged in any task. His spine was straight but not rigid, supported by the muscles of his back that had been strengthened by decades of sitting on this stool in this posture. His feet were flat on the stone floor, and he could feel the coolness of the stone through the wool of his slippers. The Tulip Era continued outside the walls of the shop and inside the walls of the shop, and in the narrow street of Archin's Mitten, and in the shadow of the Varlan's aqueduct, and in the sleeping body of the tabby cat. It was an era of peace and pleasure and cultivation, a time when the empire had turned its face away from the battlefields of the west and the east and toward the gardens and the libraries and the quiet pursuits of a civilization at its height. Aimed in a small apothecary shop in the old quarter of the city, a man of 63 winters sat on a three-legged stool and watched the dust motes drift through a shaft of filtered light and waited for nothing in particular, because everything that needed to happen would happen in its own time, and there was no reason to hurry any of it. The ceramic mortar that Ibrahim used for the final combination of saffron and opium was not the wooden olive wood vessel that sat in its depression at the western end of the workbench, nor was it the small marble mortar that waited on the lower shelf for hard seeds and staining minerals. The ceramic mortar was a distinct tool with its own history and its own character and its own place in the apothecary's collection. It sat on a dedicated square of folded felt at the center of the workbench, a position that gave Ibrahim equal access with either hand, and that allowed the light from the oiled parchment window to fall across the vessel during the middle hours of the day. The felt beneath it was grey with age and compressed to the thinness of paper where the weight of the mortar had pressed down over the years, and its purpose was to absorb the vibrations of the grinding and to prevent the ceramic base from scraping against the oak surface. The mortar itself had been made in the town of Iznik many years before Ibrahim was born, by a potter whose name was recorded on the bottom in a small impressed mark that Ibrahim had noticed once and then forgotten. The clay was a pale reddish-brown that had been covered with a white slip and then painted with cobalt blue designs before being coated in a clear glaze and fired in a kiln that burned pine wood from the forests of the Marmara region. The designs were simple, repeating patterns of small flowers and curling leaves that had been applied with a brush made from the tail hair of a squirrel, and the glaze had pooled slightly in the recesses of the pattern, creating subtle variations in the depth of the blue. The interior of the mortar was glazed in a plain white that had developed a network of fine cracks over the decades, a crazing that was not a flaw but rather a proof of age, and used a map of the thermal stresses that had accumulated during countless grinding sessions. The size of the ceramic mortar was intermediate between the large wooden one and the small marble one. It could hold perhaps twice the volume of a man's cupped hands, and its walls were thick enough to provide weight and stability, but not so thick that the vessel became unwieldy. The rim was wide and slightly flared, allowing Ibrahim to grip it securely with his left hand, while his right hand worked the pestle. The pestle that accompanied this mortar was also ceramic, made from the same Iznik clay and glazed in the same white, with the same fine crazing on its surface. The grinding end was rounded and slightly roughened by use of texture that helped to grip the materials being ground, without being so abrasive that it would wear away the glaze too quickly. The handle was shaped to fit the palm, and it had been worn smooth by the friction of Ibrahim's hand over thousands of grinding motions. The preparation for the combining of the saffron and the opium mixture began with the removal of the linen cloth from the small ceramic bowl that held the ground opium and gum Arabic powder. The powder had settled during the hours since it was prepared, and its surface was now flat and smooth, like the surface of a tiny desert dune. The color was a warm brown that had darkened slightly as the volatile oils of the opium redistributed themselves within the mixture, and the smell that rose from the bowl was the same complex bittersweet aroma that Ibrahim had noted when the grinding was complete. He set the bowl to the left of the ceramic mortar, where it would be within easy reach. The saffron was retrieved from its porcelain jar on the high shelf, a task that required Ibrahim to stand on the three-legged stool and stretch his arm to its full extension. The jar was cool in his hands, and its weight was reassuring, a solid presence that spoke of the value contained within. He carried it to the workbench and set it down to the right of the ceramic mortar, and then he removed the lid and placed it aside on the folded felt. The interior of the jar was dark, and the saffron threads within were visible only as a deep red mass that seemed to glow faintly in the light that filtered through the oiled parchment. The aroma of the saffron joined the aroma of the opium mixture in the air above the workbench, two distinct scents that had not yet combined, but that occupied the same space in a temporary truce. The amount of saffron required for the compound was small, a quantity that Ibrahim measured by eye rather than by weight, because he had prepared this mixture so many times that his fingers knew the proper pinch more reliably than the copper scales. He reached into the porcelain jar with his thumb and forefinger and withdrew a small cluster of the deep red threads, perhaps 20 or 30 of them clinging together in a loose tangle. The threads were dry and light, and they seemed to want to float upward, as if the air itself was a more congenial medium than the confines of the jar. Ibrahim held them over the mouth of the ceramic mortar and then released them, and they fell in a slow, spiraling descent, coming to rest on the white glazed bottom in a small pile that was no larger than the nail of his little finger. The contrast of the red saffron against the white ceramic was striking, and Ibrahim paused for a moment to observe it. The threads lay in a loose heap, their curled ends catching the light, and their deep color vivid against the pale background. They seemed almost alive in the way that certain dried things can seem alive, a paradox that Ibrahim had noticed before and would notice again. He reached into the jar a second time and withdrew another small pinch of threads and added them to the mortar, and then a third pinch until the pile at the bottom was roughly the size of a hazelnut. This was the correct amount for the quantity of opium mixture that waited in the bowl, and it represented a value that a merchant in the Grand Bazaar might have calculated in silver coins, but that Ibrahim thought of only in terms of the finished compound. The opium mixture was transferred next. Ibrahim picked up the ceramic bowl and tilted it slowly, allowing the fine brown powder to slide out and into the ceramic mortar, where it landed on top of the saffron threads and partially covered them. The powder was heavier than the saffron, and it settled into the spaces between the threads, creating a layered effect that was brown over red, like earth over embers. He used the tip of the smallest ox-horn spatula to scrape the last traces of powder from the bowl, and then he set the bowl aside and returned his attention to the mortar. The pestle was already in his right hand, its weight familiar and its surface cool against his palm. He lowered it into the mortar, and the first contact with the layered materials produced a soft, rustling sound as the ceramic grinding end pressed down on the saffron threads and the opium powder. This initial contact was not a grinding motion but a pressing, a gentle compression that brought the two substances into closer proximity without yet breaking down the structure of the saffron. The threads bent and flattened under the weight of the pestle, and the opium powder shifted and settled, and the two materials began their slow integration. Then the grinding began. The motion was the same oval rotation that Ibrahim used for all his grinding, a path that started at the near edge of the mortar and swept around the circumference before spiraling inward toward the center. The sound that accompanied this motion was unlike any other sound in the shop. The ceramic pestle against the ceramic interior produced a low grinding noise that had a slight high-frequency component. A faint ringing or singing that was the result of the hard glazed surfaces moving against one another with a thin layer of material between them. The saffron threads provided the initial texture, a slight resistance that could be felt through the handle of the pestle as the individual stigmas were crushed and torn and reduced to fragments. The opium powder provided a cushioning effect that softened the contact between the two ceramic surfaces and prevented the harsh scraping that would have occurred if the mortar had been empty. The sound changed as the grinding progressed. In the early stages, when the saffron threads were still largely intact and the opium powder was still separate, the sound was a mixture of soft crunching and dull grinding, the crunching coming from the breaking of the saffron and the grinding from the movement of the pestle through the powder. As the saffron broke down further and its fragments became smaller, the crunching diminished, and the sound became more uniform, a steady low rumble that was punctuated by occasional small pops as a particularly resistant thread was finally crushed. The opium powder absorbed the saffron fragments, and the two materials began to merge into a single substance that had a color different from either of its components. The color of the mixture was the primary indicator that Ibrahim used to judge the progress of the grinding. At the beginning, the mortar contained distinct regions of red and brown, the saffron threads standing out against the darker opium powder like small flames in a bed of ash. As the pestle moved and the grinding continued, the red and brown began to blend, creating streaks and swirls of intermediate shades. A streak of orange appeared where a saffron thread had been crushed and its color had mixed with the pale gum arabic component of the opium powder. A swirl of deep amber formed where the resinous oils of the opium had been released by the friction and had stained a cluster of saffron fragments. The overall color of the mixture migrated slowly from a mottled brown and red toward a uniform warm golden brown that was the signature of a properly prepared compound. The number of rotations required to achieve this uniformity was not a number that Ibrahim had ever counted, but it was a number that his body knew. The grinding of the saffron and opium together was the longest single grinding task in the apothecary's repertoire, longer than the grinding of the opium with the gum arabic, and longer than the grinding of any individual herb or spice. The saffron threads were stubborn in their resistance to being reduced to powder, their fibrous structure persisting even after the color had been largely extracted and transferred to the surrounding opium mixture. Tiny fragments of red remained visible in the golden brown mass for many minutes, catching the light and reminding Ibrahim that the work was not yet complete. The rhythm of the grinding was a meditation of sorts, though Ibrahim would not have used that word. His mind did not wander in the way that minds are said to wander during idle moments, but neither was it focused on the task in the way that a scholar focuses on a difficult text. His awareness was simply present with the motion of his wrist, and the sound of the pestle and the changing color of the mixture in the mortar. The minutes passed without being counted, and the work continued without being rushed, and the compound approached its finished state in the same way that the afternoon approached evening, at a pace that was determined by forces older and more patient than any human intention. The aroma that rose from the mortar during the grinding was the combined scent of the two precious ingredients, transformed by the friction and the pressure into something that was more than the sum of its parts. The bitter notes of the opium were softened by the floral sweetness of the saffron, and the metallic edge of the saffron was blunted by the earthy depth of the opium. The gum arabic contributed its faint sweetness, and the ceramic of the mortar contributed nothing but the ghost of all the compounds that had been ground within it. Before this one, a faint memory of cinnamon and cloves and dried rose petals that lingered in the microscopic cracks of the glaze. The overall effect was a fragrance that filled the shop and seeped out through the open doorway and mingled with the smells of the street, the dust and the stone and the distant salt of the sea. Ibrahim's left hand maintained its steady grip on the flared rim of the ceramic mortar, preventing the vessel from sliding or rotating as the pestle moved. His right hand continued the oval motion, the wrist turning and the arm moving only slightly, the work being done by the small muscles of the forearm that had been strengthened by decades of this exact activity. His breathing remained slow and even, and his eyes remained fixed on the contents of the mortar, watching the color shift and blend and deepen toward the uniform golden brown that signaled completion. The moment when the grinding was finished was not marked by any dramatic change, but by a subtle shift in the feel of the pestle and the sound of its movement. The resistance of the saffron fibers was gone, having been reduced to particles too small to be felt individually. The sound had become a smooth, soft shushing that was almost silent, the pestle gliding through the fine uniform powder with no crunching or popping or grinding. The color was even from edge to edge, a warm amber that caught the light and seemed to glow from within. Ibrahim lifted the pestle from the mortar and held it above the vessel, allowing any clinging particles to fall back into the mixture. The grinding end of the pestle was coated with a thin film of the compound, a film that was the same golden brown as the contents of the mortar, and that gleamed softly in the dim light. The mixture in the bottom of the ceramic mortar was now ready for the final step that would transform it from a loose powder into a cohesive paste that could be formed into doses and stored for future use. But that step required the honey from the Prince's Islands, and the honey had not yet arrived, and so the compound would wait. Ibrahim used the medium oxhorn spatula to gather the powder into a small pile in the center of the mortar, and then he covered the vessel with a square of clean linen that he weighted at the corners with 4 smooth pebbles from the courtyard. The linen would keep out dust and insects while allowing the compound to breathe, and the pebbles would prevent the cloth from being disturbed by any stray breeze that might find its way through the doorway. The ceramic mortar with its covered contents was moved to the back of the workbench, where it would sit undisturbed until the honey arrived. The pestle was wiped clean with a dry cloth and returned to its place beside the mortar. The porcelain saffron jar was sealed and returned to its high shelf. The small ceramic bowl that had held the opium powder was placed in the basin of water from the courtyard well to soak away the residue that clung to its interior. The shop returned to its usual state of ordered calm, and the aroma of the compound hung in the air, a pleasant reminder of the work that had been completed and a promise of the work that remained. The sound of the ceramic mortar had faded into silence, and the only sounds that remained were the distant murmur of the city, and the creak of the old buildings settling under the weight of the afternoon, and the soft, regular breathing of the apothecary as he sat once more on the 3-legged stool and waited for whatever the next hour would bring. The honey from the Prince's Islands arrived on the 3rd day after the grinding of the saffron and opium mixture, just as Ibrahim had expected it would. The beekeeper was a man named Yorgos, who kept his hives on the island of Hebeliada, where the pine forests grew down to the edge of the sea, and the air was thick with the scent of resin and wild thyme throughout the spring and summer months. Yorgos made the crossing to the mainland once each month in a small caique that he sailed himself, a vessel with a single lateen sail that was patched in 3 places with cloth that did not quite match the original canvas. He carried his honey in clay jars that had been sealed with a disc of cork and a layer of beeswax, and he sold these jars to a select group of customers who appreciated the particular quality of the island honey and who were willing to pay the price that reflected the effort of the crossing. The transaction took place in the doorway of the shop, as most transactions did. Yorgos appeared in the late morning with a cloth sack slung over his shoulder, and he set the sack down on the threshold and untied the drawstring and lifted out a single jar of honey. The jar was a simple terracotta vessel glazed on the inside only, and it was cool to the touch from having been stored in the hold of the caique during the crossing. The beeswax seal was the pale gold of fresh comb, and it bore the faint imprint of the cloth that had been pressed against it while the wax was still soft. Ibrahim took the jar in both hands and felt its weight, and noted the way the honey shifted slowly inside, a sign of proper viscosity and low water content. He paid Yorgos in small silver coins that he kept in a leather pouch in the drawer beneath the workbench, and Yorgos nodded and shouldered his sack and walked back toward the harbour, where his caique was tied to a ring in the old sea wall. The jar of honey was placed on the workbench beside the covered ceramic mortar that held the saffron and opium mixture. The linen cloth still lay over the mouth of the mortar, held in place by the 4 smooth pebbles from the courtyard, and the compound beneath had rested undisturbed for 3 days while Ibrahim went about his other tasks. He had sold a measure of dried chamomile to a woman whose infant was troubled by colic, and he had weighed out a dram of cinnamon bark for a cook who was preparing a dish for a celebration, and he had spent several hours simply sitting on the stool and watching the light move across the floor and the walls. The waiting had not been unpleasant, and the compound had not suffered from the delay. The second ingredient that would serve as the binding agent was tragacanth gum, a substance that Ibrahim kept in a small wooden box on the northern shelf. Tragacanth was the dried exudate of a low, thorny shrub that grew in the mountainous regions of eastern Anatolia and western Persia, a plant that produced a pale, translucent resin when its stem was cut. The resin dried into thin ribbons that were brittle and nearly colorless, and when these ribbons were ground into a powder and mixed with water, they swelled into a thick mucilage that was used by apothecaries and confectioners and painters, and anyone else who needed a gentle adhesive that would not react with the materials it bound. The tragacanth in Ibrahim's box had been harvested 3 years earlier, and it had lost none of its potency during its time in the cool, dark shelf. The preparation of the tragacanth was a task that Ibrahim performed in the small marble mortar because the ribbons were hard and would have scratched the glazed interior of the ceramic vessel. He selected a single ribbon from the box, a piece that was roughly the length of his middle finger and as thin as a sheet of paper, and he broke it into small fragments with his fingers. The fragments made a soft snapping sound as they separated, and they fell into the marble mortar, where they lay like tiny shards of cloudy glass. The marble pestle reduced them to a fine white powder in a matter of minutes, and the sound of the grinding was the familiar sharp ringing that Ibrahim tolerated because it was necessary. The powdered tragacanth was transferred to a small ceramic cup and mixed with a spoonful of water from the courtyard well, and the mixture was left to sit while the gum absorbed the water and swelled into a clear, thick gel. The honey was the next component to be prepared. Ibrahim broke the beeswax seal on the jar with the tip of his knife, and the wax came away in a single piece, releasing a fragrance that filled the shop with the scent of the island pines and the wild thyme and the 10,000 flowers that had contributed their nectar to the hives. The honey itself was pale, almost colorless in the jar, but when Ibrahim tilted the vessel and allowed a small amount to flow onto the tip of his horn spatula, it caught the light and revealed a warm golden color that was the essence of the summer sun, captured and concentrated by the labor of the bees. He transferred a measured amount of honey to the ceramic mortar, where the saffron and opium mixture weighted a quantity that was perhaps 2 spoonfuls by volume, though Ibrahim measured it by eye and by experience, rather than by any marked utensil. The honey pooled on top of the dry powder and began slowly to seep into the spaces between the particles. The color of the mixture changed immediately as the golden honey saturated the golden brown powder, creating a deeper, richer shade that was closer to amber than to brown. The surface of the pool reflected the light from the oiled parchment window, a small circle of gleaming gold that seemed to hold the sun itself within its shallow depth. The tragacanth gel was added next. Ibrahim scraped the clear, thick mucilage from the ceramic cup with the horn spatula and deposited it beside the pool of honey in the mortar. The gel was nearly invisible against the honey, a transparent addition that would contribute no color of its own, but would provide the structure that would hold the compound together once the liquid components had been absorbed and the mixture had dried to its final consistency. The spatula was used to fold the honey and the tragacanth into the dry powder, a slow, gentle motion that was not grinding, but combining a turning and pressing that brought the ingredients together without generating heat or friction. The folding motion was a technique that Ibrahim had developed over many years of preparing this particular compound. The spatula was inserted at the edge of the mixture and drawn toward the center, lifting and turning the material so that the dry particles were brought into contact with the wet ingredients. The motion was repeated again and again, each time from a different angle, until the mixture began to cohere into a single mass. The color continued to deepen as the honey and the tragacanth were fully incorporated, shifting from the pale golden brown of the dry powder to a dark amber that was the color of aged resin or the varnish on an old painting. The texture changed as well, from a loose, crumbly powder to a stiff paste that held its shape when pressed, and that gleamed with a subtle sheen in the dim light. The smell of the mixture at this stage was the fullest expression of the compound's character. The honey added a warm sweetness that wrapped around the bitter notes of the opium and the floral notes of the saffron, softening both and blending them into a unified fragrance that was neither medicinal nor culinary, but something between the two. The tragacanth contributed no scent of its own, but it seemed to hold the other scents in suspension, allowing them to develop and deepen as the mixture rested. The overall effect was an aroma that was calming and complex, and that seemed to belong to the apothecary shop as much as the smell of dried mint or the faint ghost of rose water. The light in the shop had been changing while Ibrahim worked, and he became aware of this change gradually, in the way that one becomes aware of the cooling of the air or the lengthening of shadows. The white, hard light of midday had softened into the golden light of late afternoon, and the rectangle of sunshine that fell through the doorway had stretched and shifted until it now climbed the northern wall and touched the lower shelves where the ceramic jars of bulk herbs sat in their cool darkness. The dust motes that drifted through the beam were fewer now, and they moved more slowly, as if the day itself was growing tired and preparing for rest. The window of oiled parchment glowed with a warm orange light that was the color of the setting sun as it approached the ridge of the old city walls. The walls themselves were visible from the street outside the shop, if one walked a short distance to the west and looked toward the Marmara shore, a line of ancient stone and brick that had been built by the Emperor Theodosius more than 1,000 years before this afternoon. The walls caught the last light of the day and held it for a few moments before releasing it to the darkening sky, and this light was reflected into the shop through the parchment window and through the open doorway and through every crack and gap in the old wooden structure. Ibrahim worked in this warm orange glow, and his movements seemed to slow in sympathy with the fading day. The folding of the paste continued until the mixture was uniform in color and texture, with no streaks of dry powder and no pockets of unmixed honey. The surface of the paste was smooth and slightly glossy, and it held the impression of the spatula for a moment, before slowly relaxing back into a level plane. The color was a deep amber that seemed to absorb the orange light and return it in a darker, richer tone, a color that reminded Ibrahim of the varnish on the old iconostasis in the small Greek church near the Patriarchate, though he had not entered that church in many years. The ceramic mortar sat in the center of the workbench with its contents complete and waiting. The paste would need to rest for several hours before it could be divided into individual doses, a rest that would allow the tragacanth to fully hydrate and the honey to distribute its moisture evenly throughout the mixture. Ibrahim covered the mortar with a fresh square of linen and replaced the 4 pebbles at the corners, and then he turned his attention to the small ritual that marked the end of the preparation. The rim of the ceramic mortar had accumulated a thin film of the paste during the folding process, a residue that had been pushed upward by the motion of the spatula and that now formed a narrow ring of amber around the white glazed edge. Ibrahim retrieved a strip of clean linen from the drawer beneath the workbench, a strip that had been torn from a larger cloth, and that was reserved for this specific purpose. He folded the strip once, and then he wiped the rim of the mortar with a slow, careful motion that followed the curve of the ceramic from one side to the other. The first pass of the linen removed most of the visible residue, leaving behind a faint smear that was barely noticeable. Ibrahim refolded the cloth to expose a clean surface, and he made a second pass around the rim, pressing slightly harder to capture the remaining traces of the paste. The second pass left the rim nearly clean, with only a slight discoloration that marked the path where the paste had been. He refolded the cloth a third time and made a final pass, a gentle wiping that removed the last faint evidence of the work that had been done. The rim of the mortar was now as clean as it had been before the ingredients were added, a white glazed circle that gleamed softly in the orange light. This wiping of the rim 3 times was a habit that Ibrahim had acquired so long ago that he could not remember when it had begun. It was not a necessary step because the small amount of paste that adhered to the rim would have dried and flaked away on its own, or could have been wiped once and been sufficiently clean. That the 3 wipes had become part of the ritual, and the ritual had become part of the calm, and Ibrahim saw no reason to change a pattern that had served him well for more than 40 years. The used linen strip was placed in a small basket that hung from a hook beside the workbench, a basket that collected scraps of cloth and paper and other small combustibles that would eventually be used as tinder for the brazier that warmed the shop during the cold months. The basket was nearly full, and Ibrahim made a mental note to empty it before the first frost, though he knew that the mental note would fade and be replaced by the sight of the overflowing basket on some future morning when the actual need arose. The light in the shop had deepened further while he attended to the rim of the mortar. The orange glow had given way to a deeper red that was the color of the sky just after the sun has dropped below the horizon and before the first stars appear. The walls of the shop seemed to recede into the gathering darkness, and the jars on the northern shelves became indistinct shapes that merged with the shadows. The only objects that remained clearly visible were those that caught the last faint light from the doorway, the curve of the ceramic mortar, and the pale gleam of the linen cloth that covered it, and the edge of the copper scales where a single beam of fading light happened to fall. Ibrahim stood and walked to the doorway and looked out at the street. The view to the west was blocked by the buildings of the old city, but he could see the sky above the rooftops, a sky that was now a deep rose color, fading to purple at the eastern edge where the first stars were beginning to appear. The silhouette of the Valens aqueduct was a dark line against the glowing sky, and the shadow that it cast had long since merged with the general darkness of the street. The tabby cat was gone from its spot against the opposite wall, having retreated to whatever warm corner it inhabited during the night. The air that came through the doorway was cooler now, carrying the smell of the sea and the faint smoke of the evening cooking fires that were being lit throughout the city. The sound of the street had changed as well, from the midday murmur to the quieter sounds of evening. The closing of shutters and the calls of children being summoned indoors and the distant cry of the resin from a minaret somewhere to the east, announcing the sunset prayer. Ibrahim stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the cool air on his face and watching the colors fade from the sky. Then he turned back into the shop and began the small tasks that would prepare the space for the night. The ceramic mortar was moved to the back of the workbench where it would sit undisturbed until the morning when the paste would have rested enough to be divided and shaped. The jar of honey was sealed with a fresh disc of wax and returned to its place on a lower shelf where it would be used for other preparations in the weeks to come. The small ceramic cup that had held the tragacanth gel was rinsed in the basin and set aside to dry. The marble mortar was wiped clean and returned to its shelf. The oxhorn spatulas were hung on their brass hooks. The copper scales were covered with a cloth to protect them from the dust that would settle during the night. The light continued to fade, and by the time Ibrahim had completed his evening routine, the shop was in near darkness. He did not light the oil lamp because there was nothing more that required light. The heavy cypress door was still open to the street, but soon he would close it and slide the iron bolt into place, and the shop would be sealed against the night. The compound in the ceramic mortar would rest in the darkness and the coolness and the silence, and by morning it would be ready for the final shaping. The day was ending in the same way that all days ended in the apothecary shop on Akshemseddin Street, slowly and quietly and without drama. The last light drained from the sky above the old city walls, and the stars emerged one by one, and the sounds of the street faded into the soft murmur of a city preparing for sleep. The morning light that fell through the oiled parchment window on the day after the honey and tragacanth had been added to the saffron and opium mixture was the pale gold light of early autumn, a light that seemed to carry within it the memory of summer and the promise of the cold to come. The shop was cool from the night, and the ceramic mortar that sat at the back of the workbench was cool to the touch when Ibrahim lifted the linen cloth and the 4 smooth pebbles that had guarded its contents through the darkness. The paste within had rested for a full night, and the rest had done its work transforming the mixture from a stiff, malleable mass into something firmer and more cohesive a material that held its shape when pressed and that had developed a subtle sheen across its smooth surface. The color was the same deep amber that it had been the evening before, perhaps a shade darker where the surface had been exposed to the air and a shade lighter in the depths where the paste had been protected from the subtle oxidation that came from contact with the atmosphere of the shop. The paste was ready for the final stage of its preparation, the division into individual doses and the careful weighing of each dose to ensure that the compound would be consistent and reliable, and that the physicians who prescribed it and the patients who received it would know exactly what they were receiving. This weighing was not a matter of greed or of stretching a valuable material to its maximum profit, but rather a matter of precision and of trust. The apothecary who weighed his compounds accurately was an apothecary whose customers returned and whose reputation spread and whose sleep at night was untroubled by any worry that he might have given too much or too little of a substance that required careful measurement. The scales that Ibrahim would use for this weighing were the copper equal arm balance that sat on its dedicated platform at the eastern end of the workbench. The scales had been recalibrated the previous morning, as they were recalibrated every morning during the damp seasons when the humidity from the Bosphorus caused the brass beam to expand by an amount too small to see, but large enough to affect the balance. The single grain of rice that served as the calibration weight sat in its small ceramic dish beside the scales, a grain that had been used for this purpose for several months and that had become as familiar to Ibrahim as any tool in the shop. The brass weights themselves rested in their wooden block, the largest being 10 dirhams and the smallest being 1/4 of a dirham, and each one stamped with a mark that indicated its value in the Ottoman system of measurement. The work surface for the dividing and weighing was a sheet of oiled paper that Ibrahim had cut from a larger roll and spread across the clean portion of the workbench to the left of the scales. The paper was a pale brown color, translucent in the thinner areas, and it had been brushed with linseed oil and allowed to dry until it was no longer tacky to the touch. The oiled surface would prevent the paste from sticking and would allow the finished discs to be lifted cleanly once they had dried sufficiently. Ibrahim smoothed the paper with the palm of his hand, pressing out any wrinkles or air bubbles that might interfere with the even formation of the doses. The first step was the division of the paste into portions of roughly equal size. This was not a precise process, but rather an approximation that would be refined by the scales. Ibrahim used the medium ox-horn spatula to cut into the mass of paste in the ceramic mortar, dividing it first into halves and then into quarters and then into eighths. The spatula slid through the material with a slight resistance, a feeling that was neither sticky nor dry, but somewhere between the two, a clean separation that left smooth surfaces on both sides of the cut. The portions were lifted from the mortar, one by one, and placed on the oiled paper where they sat like small dark hills on the pale brown landscape. Each portion was then shaped into a rough disc by the simple pressure of Ibrahim's thumb and forefinger. The paste was cool and firm, and it yielded to the pressure without crumbling and without sticking to the skin. The discs were not perfectly round because Ibrahim was not concerned with perfect roundness, only with uniformity of weight and thickness. A disc that was slightly oval would serve its purpose as well as a disc that was perfectly circular, and the small variations in shape were a reminder that the compound had been made by human hands rather than by any mechanical process. The scales were prepared for the weighing by the removal of the cloth that had covered them during the night. Ibrahim checked the balance by gently tapping the edge of one pan and watching the beam oscillate and settle back to its level position. The beam was true, and the pans hung evenly, and the silk threads that suspended them were straight and untwisted. He selected the 4 dirham weight from the wooden block, a brass piece that was shaped like a small cup and that had been polished by years of handling to a soft gleam. The weight was placed in the right-hand pan, and the pan descended slightly under its burden, while the left-hand pan rose in response. The first disc of paste was lifted from the oiled paper with the tip of the horn spatula and placed in the left-hand pan. The disc was too heavy a fact that was immediately apparent from the way the left pan sank and the right pan rose. Ibrahim removed the disc and used the spatula to shave a small amount of paste from its edge, a thin curl of amber that he returned to the ceramic mortar. The disc was placed back in the pan, and this time the beam was closer to level, but still favored the left side by a small margin. Another shaving was removed and returned to the mortar, and the disc was weighed again. Now the beam hung level with the left pan, and the right pan balanced in perfect equilibrium. The correct disc was removed from the pan and placed on a fresh area of the oiled paper where it would rest while its companions were weighed. Ibrahim made a small mark on the paper beside the disc, using the tip of the spatula to scratch a faint line that would remind him which discs had been weighed and which had not. The mark was barely visible, and it would serve its purpose for the short time that was required. The second disc was placed in the pan, and this time it was too light, the left pan rising and the right pan sinking under the weight of the 4 dirham brass piece. Ibrahim retrieved a small amount of paste from the ceramic mortar, the shavings that had been removed from the first disc, and he pressed this additional material onto the surface of the second disc, blending it with his fingertip until it was incorporated. The disc was weighed again, and it was still slightly light, and so another small addition was made, and then the beam hung level, and the second disc joined the first on the oiled paper. The process continued for each of the portions that had been cut from the mass in the mortar. Some discs required material to be removed, and some required material to be added, and a few were exactly correct on the first weighing, a small satisfaction that Ibrahim noted without any outward sign. The shavings and additions were managed so that the total amount of paste remained constant, the material that was removed from the heavy discs being used to supplement the light ones until all of the discs had been brought to the same weight of 4 dirhams. The number of discs that resulted from this batch of compound was 11, a number that Ibrahim had not predicted, but that he accepted as the natural outcome of the amount of paste and the chosen dose weight. 11 doses of 4 dirhams each represented a total of 44 dirhams of finished compound, a quantity that would last for several months, depending on the frequency with which it was requested. The discs lay on the oiled paper in a loose arrangement, their amber surfaces gleaming softly in the morning light, and their shapes varying slightly from one to the next in the small ways that marked them as handmade. The weighing had required a certain amount of time, but Ibrahim did not measure that time in minutes or hours. He measured it in the number of discs that now rested on the oiled paper, and in the satisfaction of knowing that each one contained exactly the amount of compound that it was supposed to contain. The brass weight of 4 dirhams was returned to its hole in the wooden block, and the scales were covered once more with their protective cloth. The ceramic mortar was nearly empty now, with only a thin film of paste remaining on its interior surface, a film that would be cleaned later when the tools were washed. The discs needed to dry before they could be stored. They were too soft at this stage to be handled without deforming, and they would stick to one another if they were placed in a jar or a box while still moist. Ibrahim left them on the oiled paper in their loose arrangement, and he moved the paper to the back of the workbench where the air was still and the light was dim, and the temperature remained stable throughout the day. The drying would take several hours or perhaps until the following morning, depending on the humidity of the air and the exact composition of the honey and the tragacanth in this particular batch. Ibrahim did not hurry the drying any more than he had hurried the grinding or the mixing or the weighing. The storage jar that would eventually hold the dried discs waited on a shelf near the northern wall. The jar was made of the same blue glazed ceramic as the large jars that stood by the door, but it was much smaller. A vessel that could be held in one hand and that had been thrown on a potter's wheel by a craftsman in the town of Constantinople on the Asian shore of the Dardanelles. The glaze was the deep blue of the Bosphorus on a winter afternoon, and it covered the exterior and the interior and the rim, leaving only the unglazed foot ring where the clay was visible as a warm terracotta. The jar had a fitted lid of the same blue ceramic with a small knob on top, and the lid seated into a groove in the rim that created a seal tight enough to keep out dust and insects, but not so tight that the compound would be deprived of the small amount of air circulation that it required. The wooden stopper that would provide the final seal was not part of the jar itself, but a separate piece that Ibrahim had carved from a block of cork oak bark many years ago. The stopper was shaped like a truncated comb, wider at the top than at the bottom, and it had been compressed by years of use so that it fit perfectly into the mouth of the blue jar. The cork was dark brown and slightly spongy, and it smelled faintly of the compounds it had sealed over the years, a ghost of saffron and opium and honey and tragacanth that lingered in the porous material. The wax that would seal the stopper to the jar was kept in a small iron pot that hung from a hook near the brazier, though the brazier was not lit during the warm months. The wax was a mixture of beeswax from the Prince's Islands and a small amount of pine resin that gave it a slightly sticky quality and a pleasant fragrance. The wax was hard and pale yellow in its pot, and it would need to be warmed before it could be used to seal the jar. Ibrahim would warm the wax in the evening when the discs had dried sufficiently, and when the blue jar had been filled and the stopper had been pressed into place. The hours of the morning and the early afternoon passed in the usual slow rhythm while the discs dried on their oiled paper. Ibrahim attended to the other small tasks of the shop. He swept the threshold where a few leaves from the plane tree down the street had blown in during the night. He wiped the blue jars by the door with a damp cloth to remove the fine dust that had settled on their shoulders. He sat on the three-legged stool and watched the shadow of the aqueduct creep across the cobblestones outside. A customer came and purchased a small quantity of dried rose petals for a bath, and another came seeking a remedy for a cough that had troubled him since the weather began to cool, and Ibrahim measured out a mixture of licorice root and marshmallow and anise seed and wrapped it in a square of paper. By the late afternoon, the discs on the oiled paper had dried to a state that Ibrahim judged to be ready. They were firm to the touch but not hard, and they retained a slight flexibility that would prevent them from cracking or crumbling when handled. The surface of each disc had developed a thin skin, a slightly lighter layer that was the result of the evaporation of moisture from the honey and the tragacanth gel. This skin gave the discs a matte appearance that was different from the glossy surface of the fresh paste, and it would protect the interior of each dose from further drying until the disc was used. The transfer of the dried discs to the blue ceramic jar was a careful operation that Ibrahim performed with the smallest of the ox-horn spatulas. Each disc was lifted gently from the oiled paper and lowered into the jar where it settled against the bottom or against the disc that had been placed before it. The discs fit together in the jar with small gaps between them, gaps that would allow air to circulate and prevent any moisture that might remain from being trapped and causing spoilage. The jar was not filled to the brim because Ibrahim had learned long ago that leaving a small space at the top allowed for the expansion and contraction of the air as the temperature changed and prevented the stopper from being pushed out by pressure. When all 11 discs had been transferred to the jar, Ibrahim took a moment to look at them through the blue glazed opening. The amber color of the compound was visible even in the dim light at the jar's interior. a warm golden brown that seemed to glow against the dark blue of the ceramic. The discs lay in a neat stack with their edges aligned and their surfaces parallel, and they looked like something that had been made with care and patience and that would serve its purpose when the time came. The wooden stopper was retrieved from the drawer where it waited between uses. Ibrahim inspected it, briefly turning it in his fingers to ensure that no cracks had developed and that no debris had adhered to its surface. The stopper was sound and clean, and it smelled faintly of the compounds it had sealed before this one. He pressed it into the mouth of the jar using a firm, steady pressure that seated the cork firmly in the opening without forcing it so deep that it would be difficult to remove. The stopper fit perfectly as it always did, and the jar was now sealed against the dust and the insects and the slow degradation that came from exposure to the air. The final step was the wax seal, a thin layer of the warmed beeswax and pine resin mixture that would be poured over the top of the stopper and the rim of the jar. Ibrahim lit a small oil lamp and placed the iron pot of wax over the flame, watching as the pale yellow solid softened and then melted into a clear golden liquid. The smell of the melting wax joined the other smells of the shop, the honey and the beeswax and the pine resin and the faint ghost of the compound itself. When the wax was fully liquid, Ibrahim removed the pot from the flame and carried it carefully to the workbench where the sealed jar waited. The pouring of the wax was a slow, deliberate motion that Ibrahim performed with the same unhurried precision that he applied to all his tasks. He tilted the iron pot, and a thin stream of golden liquid flowed from its spout and onto the top of the wooden stopper, spreading outward until it reached the ceramic rim, and then stopping as the surface tension held it in place. The wax was hot enough to flow, but not so hot that it would damage the cork or cause the compound inside the jar to warm. Ibrahim poured a second thin layer over the first, ensuring that the entire surface of the stopper and the joint where it met the ceramic was covered with a continuous film of wax. The wax cooled quickly in the cool air of the shop, changing from a clear golden liquid to a translucent pale yellow solid. As it cooled, it shrank slightly, pulling tight against the stopper and the ceramic and creating a seal that was both airtight and watertight. The surface of the cooled wax was smooth and slightly glossy, and it bore no marks or impressions, because Ibrahim had not pressed his seal into it. The blue jar with its 11 discs of amber compound was not a product that required a maker's mark. It was simply a preparation that would be used by those who needed it, and the quality of the contents would speak for itself. The sealed jar was carried to the locked drawer beneath the workbench, where Ibrahim kept the small supply of finished compounds that were ready for sale. The drawer was made of cedar wood, and it had a simple iron lock that was opened with a key that Ibrahim wore on a cord around his neck. He placed the blue jar in the drawer beside a similar jar that was nearly empty and a small wooden box that held a different compound altogether. The drawer was closed and locked, and the key was tucked back beneath his vest where it rested against his chest. The work of the weighing and sealing was complete. The compound had been transformed from a mass of paste into 11 individual doses, each one weighing exactly 4 dirhams, and each one sealed in a blue ceramic jar beneath a layer of golden wax. The jar would wait in the darkness of the locked drawer until a customer came seeking what it contained. The shop was quiet, and the afternoon light was beginning to soften toward evening, and Ibrahim sat once more on the 3-legged stool and allowed his hands to rest on his thighs and his breathing to settle into its usual slow rhythm. The day had been a good day, and the work had been good work, and there was nothing more that needed to be done until tomorrow. The washing of the tools was the final ritual of the apothecary's day, a practice that Ibrahim had performed so many times that his hands knew the sequence without any direction from his conscious mind. The evening light was fading into the soft grey of twilight, and the shop had grown dimmer with each passing minute, until the jars on the northern shelves were no longer distinct objects, but only shapes against the pale plaster. The oiled parchment window glowed with the last faint light from the sky above the rooftops, a light that was no longer golden or orange, but a deep violet blue that held the memory of the departed sun. The sounds of the street had changed from the bustle of commerce to the quieter rhythms of evening, the closing of shutters and the footsteps of people returning to their homes and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. The ceramic mortar that had held the saffron and opium paste was the first tool to receive attention. It sat at the back of the workbench where Ibrahim had left it, After transferring the weighed discs to the oiled paper, and the interior surface still bore a thin film of the amber compound, a residue that had dried during the hours of the afternoon and had become slightly tacky to the touch. The mortar was made of glazed ceramic, and it could be washed with water, unlike the wooden mortar that absorbed moisture and swelled and cracked if treated carelessly. Ibrahim carried the ceramic vessel to the courtyard behind the shop, a small open space that was enclosed by the walls of the surrounding buildings, and that contained a well and a fig tree and a stone basin that caught the water when it was drawn. The well was old, its stones worn smooth by the ropes and buckets of countless years, and its water was cool and clear and carried a faint mineral taste that came from the deep aquifers beneath the city. Ibrahim lowered the wooden bucket on its rope and heard the soft splash as it met the surface of the water far below, and then he drew it up hand over hand, feeling the weight increase as the bucket filled. The water was poured into the stone basin where it sat still and dark, reflecting the pale sky above. He dipped a corner of a coarse linen cloth into the basin and began to wipe the interior of the ceramic mortar, using the same slow circular motion that he used when grinding. The water softened the dried paste, and the cloth lifted it away, leaving the white glazed surface clean and gleaming. The rinse water in the basin took on a faint golden hue as the residue of the compound dissolved and dispersed. Ibrahim did not pour this water down the drain of the street, for there was no such drain in the courtyard, and the custom of the house was to return what could be returned to the earth from which it had come. He carried the basin to the base of the fig tree that grew in the corner of the courtyard, a tree that had been planted by old Haggott many decades before Ibrahim had first entered the shop. The fig tree was old, and its trunk was thick and twisted, and its branches spread out over the courtyard, providing shade in the summer and dropping its broad leaves in the autumn. The roots of the tree extended deep into the soil, and they drank whatever moisture was offered to them. Ibrahim ticked the basin slowly, and the golden-tinged water flowed out in a thin stream and sank into the earth at the base of the fig tree. The water disappeared quickly, leaving only a dark patch on the soil that would fade as the moisture percolated downward. The roots of the tree would take up the water and the small amount of dissolved compound that it carried, and the tree would continue to grow and to produce its figs year after year, and no one would ever know that the apothecary's wash water had nourished it. This was a private transaction between Ibrahim and the tree, a small ritual that had no witnesses and that required no acknowledgement. The ceramic mortar was dried with a clean cloth and returned to its place on the square of folded felt at the center of the workbench. The ceramic pestle was wiped clean as well and laid across the mouth of the mortar in its usual resting position. The two objects sat together in the gathering darkness, their white glazed surfaces catching the last faint light from the window and glowing softly like pale stones in a stream bed. The wooden mortar required different care. Ibrahim lifted it from its circular depression on the workbench and held it in both hands, feeling its familiar weight and the smooth warmth of the olive wood. The mortar had been used earlier in the day for the grinding of the opium and gum arabic mixture, and its interior surface bore a faint residue of that work, a fine brown powder that clung to the polished wood. Water could not be used on this vessel because water would raise the grain and swell the fibers and eventually cause the wood to crack. The cleaning of the wooden mortar was a dry process that relied on friction and patience and a square of coarse linen cloth. The cloth was the same one that Ibrahim had used that morning, and it was folded into a pad that fit comfortably in his palm. He wiped the interior of the mortar with slow circular motions, pressing firmly enough to lift the residue, but not so firmly that he would wear away the polished surface that had taken decades to develop. The powder came away easily, transferring from the wood to the cloth and leaving behind the clean, smooth surface that smelled faintly of all the things that had been ground within it over the years. The cloth was shaken out over the threshold of the door, and the fine particles of opium and gum arabic dispersed into the evening air, joining the dust of the street and the pollen of the plane trees and the countless other small fragments that made up the atmosphere of the city. The pestle of olive wood was wiped with the same care, its rounded grinding end cleaned of any residue, and its handle polished by the friction of the cloth. Ibrahim inspected the small crack near the rim on the eastern side, the crack that he had filled with beeswax and pine resin 20 years ago and that had never grown larger. The repair was sound, and the mortar was ready for another day of work. He returned the vessel to its depression on the workbench and laid the pestle across its mouth, and the two olive wood objects settled into the positions they had occupied for more than 4 decades. The marble mortar on the lower shelf had been used that day for the grinding of the tragacanth ribbons, and its interior was dusted with a fine white powder that was the residue of that process. The marble could be washed with water, and so Ibrahim carried it to the courtyard and rinsed it in the stone basin using a small amount of fresh water drawn from the well. The white powder dissolved and the water became cloudy for a moment before clearing as it was poured onto the roots of the fig tree. The marble was dried with a soft cloth and returned to its shelf, where it would wait in the cool darkness until the next hard seed or staining mineral required its particular hardness. The ox-horn spatulas were the next tools to be cleaned. There were 7 of them hanging from their brass hooks on the side of the shelving unit, each one a different size and each one used for a different purpose. Ibrahim took them down one by one and wiped them with a dry cloth that had been reserved for this purpose, a cloth that was soft and lint-free and that would not scratch the polished surface of the horn. The spatulas were clean already because Ibrahim wiped them after each use, and the additional wiping was more of a ritual than a necessity. The largest spatula was returned to its hook, and then the medium ones, and finally the smallest one, the one no longer than his little finger that was used exclusively for the saffron and the other precious substances. The row of 7 spatulas hung in a neat line, their pale golden surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim light. The copper scales required no washing, but they did require covering. Ibrahim took the cloth that was kept for this purpose, a square of soft linen that had been washed many times and was now a pale grey, and he draped it over the balance beam and the pans and the brass pillar. The cloth protected the scales from the dust that would settle during the night and from the insects that might otherwise explore the gleaming copper surfaces. The covered scales looked like a small tent on their dedicated platform, a shape that was familiar and reassuring. The blue jars by the door were already clean and arranged, and they would remain in their positions through the night. The northern shells, with their 47 cubbies and their glass bottles and ceramic pots and wooden boxes, were already in order, because Ibrahim had checked them that morning, and nothing had been disturbed during the day. The Chinese porcelain jar on its high shelf held the remaining saffron threads, and it was sealed and secure. The cedar box on the bottom shelf held the remaining opium bricks, and it was closed and cool. The locked drawer beneath the workbench held the blue ceramic jar with its 11 discs of amber compound, and the key was around Ibrahim's neck where it belonged. The sweeping of the floor was the next task in the evening sequence. Ibrahim retrieved the hand broom from its hook beside the doorframe and began to sweep from the threshold inward, using the same gentle arc that he used each morning. The dust and the small debris that had accumulated during the day was gathered into a small pile near the center of the floor. There was a dried leaf that had blown in from the street, and a few fragments of dried herb that had escaped from the mortar during the grinding, and a single dead moth that had found its way inside and had come to rest on the windowsill before expiring. The pile was swept onto a small flat piece of wood that served as a dustpan, and then it was carried to the courtyard and scattered on the soil near the fig tree. The floor was now clean, and the tools were clean, and the jars were in order, and the compound was sealed and stored. The shop was ready for the night. Ibrahim walked to the doorway and stood for a moment looking out at Arc Shenzmetson Street. The twilight had deepened into full night, and the sky above the rooftops was a dark blue velvet scattered with the first bright stars. The air was cool and still, and it carried the smell of the sea and the faint smoke of the last cooking fires. The street was empty now, except for a single figure walking slowly in the distance. A shape that might have been Mustafa the street sweeper making his final pass before retiring to whatever corner he inhabited. The windows of the buildings opposite were dark, or showed only the faint glow of an oil lamp behind a curtain. The city was settling into sleep. The heavy cypress door swung inward on its greased hinges, and Ibrahim pulled it closed until the iron bolt met its bracket. He lifted the bolt and slid it into place, and the metal made its low grinding sound that was not unpleasant but rather reassuring. A sound that meant the shop was closed and the day was finished and the world outside was sealed away until morning. The door fit snugly in its frame, and the only light that entered now was a thin line of pale grey where the bolt met the wood, the same line that had been visible in the morning when the day began. The shop was dark now, but not completely dark. A faint glow came through the oiled parchment window, a glow that was the accumulated light of the stars and the distant lamps of the city reflected from the low clouds that were moving in from the sea. The glow was enough to show the outlines of the workbench and the shelves and the jars, but not enough to reveal any details. The ceramic mortar was a pale shape on the dark wood. The copper scales were a tent of shadow under their cloth. The blue jars by the door were dark masses against the wall. Ibrahim did not light the oil lamp because there was nothing more that required light. He stood in the center of the shop and listened to the silence. The sounds of the street were muffled by the closed door, and the only thing he could hear was the creak of the old building settling into the cool of the night. A beam in the ceiling made its long, slow exhalation. A floorboard near the door clicked softly. The plaster on the northern wall released a fine shower of dust that was invisible in the darkness, and it would settle on the surfaces below and be swept away in the morning. The temperature in the shop was dropping slowly as the stone walls released the heat they had absorbed during the day. The air smelled of all the things that lived in the jars and the ceramic vessels, and the wooden boxes, the sharp mineral scent of dried alum, and the dusty sweetness of licorice root, and the faint floral ghost of rose petals, and the deeper, warmer notes of the saffron and opium compound that still lingered from the day's work. These smells would fade during the night, absorbed by the wood and the plaster and the fabric of the curtains, and they would be replaced by the cool, neutral smell of the closed shop. Ibrahim walked to the heavy curtain of dark blue wool that separated the front room from his sleeping quarters. The curtain was faded along the fold lines to a soft grey, and it hung still in the motionless air. He pushed it aside and stepped into the small room behind the shop. The room was darker than the shop because it had no window, and the only light was the faint glow that followed him through the curtain. The sleeping platform was a dark shape against the wall, and the cedar chest was a darker shape beside it. The copper basin held the water that he had drawn that morning, and it was cool and still. He removed his sleeveless vest and hung it on a wooden peg that was driven into the wall. He removed his slippers and placed them beside the sleeping platform precisely where his feet would find them in the morning. He lay down on the platform and felt the familiar creak as his weight settled onto the wool blanket and the thin mattress beneath. The blanket was rough and warm, and it smelled of the cedar chest where it was stored during the day. The sounds of the building continued their slow conversation. A beam adjusted to the cooling air. A floorboard responded to a change in humidity. The old stones of the lower walls pressed against one another with a pressure that was too subtle to hear, but that could be felt as a presence in the darkness. The city outside was quiet now, with only the distant cry of a night bird and the far-off sound of water lapping against the hulls of the fishing boats in the harbour. Ibrahim closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. The shop was dark and still, and the jars on the northern shelves waited in their cubbies. The wooden mortar sat in its depression on the workbench with its pestle across its mouth. The ceramic mortar gleamed faintly on its square of felt. The blue jar, with its 11 discs of amber compound, rested in the locked drawer beneath the bench. The fig tree in the courtyard drank the last of the moisture from the washwater, and its roots grew a little deeper into the ancient soil of Constantinople. The night passed over the city in its usual slow course. The stars wheeled overhead, and the moon rose somewhere behind the clouds, and the tide in the Bosphorus turned and began to flow southward toward the Sea of Marmara. The aqueduct stood in the darkness, its arches spanning the valley between the hills, and its shadow lay across the empty street, where the tabby cat had found a new corner to sleep. The Tulip Era continued in the palaces, and the gardens, and the pavilions along the water, but in the apothecary shop on Action-Seton Street, there was only the quiet breathing of a man of 63 winters, and the slow settling of an old building, and the patient waiting of the tools and the jars, and the compounds for the morning light that would come again and begin the day once more.